Chapter 1. The Weight of Wings. There are moments in the span of empires when the fate of millions turns upon a single word, a gesture, a choice made in the space between heartbeats. On Ulanor Prime, beneath the smoke-stained sky of a world cleansed by fire and blade, such a moment had arrived. The greatest gathering of the Emperor's sons since the triumph at Compliance 6319 stretched across the vast ceremonial grounds, their banners snapping in the wind that carried the acrid scent of victory and the distant echo of still-burning orc settlements. The Emperor of Mankind stood upon the obsidian dais, his golden armor catching the dying light of Ulanor's sun. Around him, arranged in the perfect formations that had become the hallmark of the Great Crusade, stood the primarchs of the Space Marine Legions. Each bore the scars and honors of the campaign that had just ended, their armor darkened by smoke and stained with the blood of green-skinned tyrants. Yet for all the weight of their achievements, for all the worlds brought into compliance and the Xenos threats purged from the galaxy's heart, this moment carried a tension that even the most junior Astartes could feel pressing against their enhanced senses. Horus Lupercal, the War Master in all but name, stood at the forefront of his brothers. His pale features bore the easy confidence that had marked him since his first days as the Lunar Wolves' primogenitor. The campaign had been his to orchestrate, his strategic mind that had broken the Orc Empire of Ulanor, his charisma that had bound the disparate Legion forces into a weapon of unparalleled efficiency. The assembled multitudes expected what they had long believed inevitable. The Emperor's most favored son would receive the formal recognition that was his due. Yet Sanguinius of the Blood Angels stood apart, his perfect features touched by an expression of growing unease. The great angel's wings, folded against his crimson-armored form, seemed to tremble with some prescient knowledge. His eyes, darker than the void between stars, remained fixed upon their father's golden visage. Something stirred in the deepest reaches of his transhuman consciousness, a whisper of futures both terrible and magnificent, dancing at the edges of perception. The Emperor raised his hand, and silence fell across the assembly like a shroud drawn over the dead. When he spoke, his voice carried across the vastness of the ceremonial ground without need for amplification, each word weighted with the authority of one who had walked among humanity since its first stumbling steps from the cradle of ancient terror. "My sons," the Emperor began, his gaze sweeping across the assembled primarchs. "The Great Crusade stands at the threshold of its greatest triumph. The galaxy trembles before the advance of imperial truth, and countless worlds await liberation from the darkness of old night. Yet the scope of this undertaking has grown beyond what any single mind, even my own, can encompass from the Golden Throne. The time has come to place the burden of command upon shoulders broad enough to bear it." Horus straightened, his scarred hands clasping behind his back in the parade rest that had become his signature stance during formal ceremonies. Around him, his brother primarchs maintained their positions, yet the tension in the air grew thick enough to taste. Fulgrim's perfect features bore a knowing smile. Ferrus Manus stood like an iron statue, his silver eyes reflecting nothing of his thoughts. Guilliman watched with the analytical gaze of a strategist already calculating the implications of what was to come. The title of War Master has been earned through blood and sacrifice, through the demonstration of tactical acumen and the capacity to bind disparate forces into unified purpose. The Emperor's words fell like hammer blows upon an anvil, each syllable ringing with finality. Yet above all, this role demands not the strength to conquer, but the wisdom to know when conquest must yield to compassion, when the sword must be tempered by the heart. The shift was subtle, but those who knew the Emperor's ways felt it like a change in the wind before a storm. His golden gaze moved past Horus, past the expectant faces of his other sons, and settled upon the winged figure of Sanguinius. The great angel's breath caught in his throat, his enhanced hearing picking up the whispered prayers of his blood angel's honor guard as they recognized the import of their father's attention. Sanguinius. The Emperor's voice carried a weight that seemed to press down upon the very stones of Ulanor Prime. Step forward. The moment stretched like molten metal drawn into wire. Sanguinius moved with the fluid grace that marked all his kind, yet each step seemed to carry the weight of destiny itself. His wings spread slightly, casting shadows across the assembled ranks of Astartes. When he reached the foot of the obsidian dais, he knelt, his perfect features raised toward the golden figure of his father. "Rise, my son," the Emperor commanded, his voice softer now, touched with something that might have been paternal affection. "Rise, and accept the burden that I would place upon your shoulders. Let the galaxy know that Sanguinius of the Blood Angels stands as War Master of the Great Crusade, first among equals, bearer of my will and executor of humanity's manifest destiny among the stars." The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of ceremony, but the stunned absence of sound that follows a lightning strike. Across the vast assembly, 10,000 throats drew breath in unison, yet no voice dared break the weight of what had just occurred. Sanguinius rose slowly, his wings folding against his back like a crimson shroud. "Father," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the ceremonial ground despite its quiet tone, "I am not worthy of this honor. My brother Horus has proven himself the architect of victory, the master of strategy, whose mind has guided our triumphs across 100 worlds. Surely, worthiness is not determined by those who would claim it," the Emperor interrupted, his golden eyes blazing with an inner fire that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. "Worthiness is recognized by those with the vision to see it. You will accept this burden, my son, not because you desire it, but because you understand its weight." From the assembled ranks of Primarchs, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Guilliman stepped forward, his voice carrying the formal tones of military protocol. "Father, if it is your will, then we stand ready to serve under Sanguinius's command." His words carried the weight of genuine support, the analytical mind of the Ultramarines Primarch already recognizing the wisdom in the choice. Rogel Dawn's voice followed, blunt and unwavering. The Imperial fists acknowledge Sanguinius as War Master. His honor is beyond question. The Master of Fortification's declaration carried the authority of absolute certainty, his scarred features set in lines of grim approval. Yet not all reactions were ones of immediate acceptance. Angron's scarred features twisted into a scowl, the butcher's nails sending spikes of aggression through his enhanced nervous system. "The angel has pretty wings," he growled, his voice carrying the perpetual edge of barely controlled violence. "But wings do not win wars. Blood does. The 12th Legion follows strength, not sentiment." Magnus the Red maintained his silence, though those with psychic sensitivity could feel the currents of prescient knowledge swirling around the Crimson King's towering form. His single eye held depths of understanding that suggested he alone among the Primarchs truly comprehended the implications of their father's choice. And Horus stood as if carved from pale marble, his handsome features betraying nothing of the storm that raged within his enhanced mind. When he finally moved, it was to step forward and kneel before his newly elevated brother. "My Lord War Master," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion that ran beneath the surface. "The sons of Horus stand ready to serve." The formal words came easily, born of centuries of military protocol, yet those who knew him best could detect the hairline cracks in his composure, the subtle tension in his shoulders that spoke of barely contained anguish. Sanguinius looked down at his brother, his perfect features touched by an expression of profound sorrow. "Rise, my brother. I would have your counsel, not your submission. In this, as in all things, we are equals save for the burden that our father has placed upon my shoulders." The ceremony continued with the formal presentations and oaths of loyalty, yet the weight of what had transpired hung over the assembly like a thundercloud pregnant with lightning. As the Primarchs filed past to offer their acknowledgement to the new War Master, each carried with them the seeds of the future that would grow from this single moment of choice. When the formal proceedings concluded and the great assembly began to disperse, the Emperor approached his newly appointed War Master. The other Primarchs had withdrawn to a respectful distance, yet the weight of their attention remained focused upon the golden figure and his winged son. "You understand why this choice was necessary," the Emperor said, his voice pitched for Sanguinius's ears alone. The statement carried no question, no doubt of the great angel's perception. Sanguinius nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that seemed to encompass the weight of countless futures. "You see what Horus would become under the pressure of absolute authority. His pride, his need for approbation, they would make him vulnerable to influences that seek to corrupt rather than guide. And yet you do not welcome this burden," the Emperor observed, studying his son with the analytical gaze of one who had shaped the course of human history for millennia. "No, father," Sanguinius replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute honesty. "I do not. The angel of death that dwells within my gene seed, the visions that plague my dreams. I fear what I might become when pressed to the breaking point that absolute command will surely bring." The Emperor placed a gauntleted hand upon his son's shoulder, the gesture carrying a weight of affection that he rarely displayed before others. "It is precisely because you fear what you might become that you are suited to bear this responsibility. Those who hunger for power are least suited to wield it wisely. Those who accept it reluctantly are most likely to use it well." As father and son stood together on the obsidian dais, the dying light of Ulanor's sun, casting long shadows across the ceremonial ground, neither spoke of the future that stretched before them like an unwritten scroll. Neither mentioned the whispers of darkness that already stirred at the edges of the galaxy, the ancient powers that watched the Imperium's expansion with malevolent interest. Neither acknowledged the price that would inevitably be paid for this moment of choice. Yet in the silence between them, in the space where words carried insufficient weight to bear the burden of prophecy, both father and son understood that the galaxy had turned upon a new axis. The Great Crusade would continue, but it would follow a different path than the one that fate had originally decreed. And in the shadows cast by their figures upon the stone, darker possibilities began to take shape. Chapter 2. The Angel's Burden. The great strategium aboard the flagship Red Tier hummed with the quiet efficiency that had become the hallmark of the Blood Angels Legion. Holographic displays cast their pale light across the assembled officers, each projection showing the disposition of forces across a dozen systems where the Great Crusade continued its inexorable advance. Yet for all the familiar rhythms of military planning, something fundamental had shifted in the weeks following the triumph at Ulanor. Sanguinius stood at the center of the vast chamber, his perfect features illuminated by the cold glow of tactical displays. The War Master's ceremonial cloak worked with threads of gold and bearing the double-headed aquila of imperial authority, hung heavy upon his shoulders. Each mark of his new rank seemed to weigh upon him like chains forged from responsibility itself. His dark eyes moved across the strategic projections with the analytical precision that had marked him since his first days as a military commander, yet those who knew him best could detect the subtle signs of strain that even his transhuman physiology could not entirely mask. "The Zerath compliance proceeds ahead of schedule," reported Captain Azkalan of the Sanguinary Guard, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency that had made him indispensable to his Primarch's inner circle. "Lord Ferrus reports that the Iron Hands have broken the primary fortress cities. Resistance is collapsing across 3 continents." Sanguinius nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "And the civilian casualties?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished flame. Around the strategium, the assembled officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the change in their Primarch's approach to warfare. Under the previous command structure, such concerns would have been secondary to the speed of compliance, the efficiency of conquest measured in worlds claimed rather than lives preserved. "Estimated at 47% of the planetary population," Azkaelan replied, his tone carefully neutral, "within acceptable parameters for resistance of this magnitude." "Acceptable." Sanguinius repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. His wings stirred against his armored back, a gesture his inner circle had learned to recognize as a sign of deep contemplation. 15 billion souls, and we name their deaths acceptable because they stood between us and our goal. From the shadows at the edge of the strategium, a voice carried the weight of bitter experience. "That is the nature of conquest, brother." Horus Lupercal stepped into the pale light, his scarred armor bearing the fresh marks of the Melanthor campaign, the Lunar Wolves. Primarch's handsome features bore an expression of carefully controlled patience, though those with enhanced senses could detect the subtle tension in his posture. The galaxy will not bow to kind words and gentle persuasion. It bows to strength, to the certainty of imperial truth, backed by the edge of a blade. The 2 Primarchs faced each other across the holographic displays, their contrasting approaches to warfare suddenly thrown into stark relief. Sanguinius regarded his brother with eyes that held depths of sorrow, while Horus maintained the expression of pragmatic determination that had marked his approach to the Great Crusade since its earliest days. "Perhaps," Sanguinius said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite its soft tone. "Yet I cannot help but wonder if we lose something of ourselves each time we choose the swift path over the compassionate one. These are human worlds, Horus. The people we kill today were meant to be the citizens we protect tomorrow." Horus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that would have been invisible to baseline human perception, but stood out clearly to his enhanced brother. "Sentiment," he said, the word carrying an edge of frustrated dismissal. "The Emperor chose you as War Master, and I have sworn my loyalty to that choice. But sentiment will not conquer the galaxy. It will not bring unity to the scattered worlds of mankind." The strategium fell silent, the assembled officers suddenly finding their tactical displays of consuming interest. The tension between the 2 Primarchs crackled through the air like the static charge before a lightning strike. Yet before either could speak again, the great doors of the chamber hissed open to admit a new figure. Robert Gilliman strode into the strategium with the measured pace that characterized all his movements, his blue and gold armor pristine, despite the recent conclusion of his own campaigns. The Ultramarines. Primarch's analytical gaze swept across the assembled officers before settling upon his 2 brothers. If he sensed the tension between them, His perfect features gave no indication of it. "My Lord Warmaster," Guilliman said, offering a precisely calculated bow that acknowledged Sanguinius's authority while maintaining the dignity due to a fellow Primarch. "I bring word from the Cadian sector. The compliance proceeds, though we face complications." Sanguinius turned toward his brother with obvious relief at the interruption. "What manner of complications, Robuta?" "The local nobility have offered surrender terms," Guilliman replied, producing a data slate from his belt. "They propose to maintain their existing governmental structures under Imperial oversight, with gradual integration into the wider Imperium over the course of 2 generations. In exchange, they offer full compliance without further resistance." Horus stepped forward, his scarred features set in lines of immediate disapproval. "Appeasement of local power structures. Such arrangements breed corruption and eventual rebellion. Better to crush their nobility entirely and rebuild from loyal foundations." "The alternative," Guilliman continued, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm, "is a siege that our analysts estimate will last 18 months and cost approximately 12 billion civilian lives, along with significant Astartes casualties across 4 separate Legion forces." The choice crystallized the fundamental difference between the 2 approaches to conquest that now pulled the Great Crusade in different directions. Sanguinius studied the data slate with intense concentration, his perfect features reflecting the weight of decision that rested upon his shoulders alone. "The local nobility," he said finally. "What manner of rulers have they proven themselves to be? Do they serve their people well, or do they grind them beneath the heel of oppression?" "Our intelligence suggests competent governance," Guilliman replied. "Population health indices are above Imperial averages. Educational systems function effectively. Trade flows suggest economic stability. They appear to be effective administrators rather than parasitic oligarchs." Sanguinius nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing with the weight of moral certainty. "Then we accept their terms. Better to preserve billions of lives and guide them gradually toward Imperial truth than to purchase swift compliance with the blood of the innocent." Horus's reaction was immediate and visceral, though he controlled his expression with iron discipline. "You set a dangerous precedent," he said, his voice carrying the edge of barely contained frustration. "Word will spread that the Imperium can be bargained with, that resistance need not mean destruction. How many other worlds will demand similar terms? How many years will be added to the crusade while we negotiate with every petty tyrant who claims dominion over a handful of star systems?" "As many years as necessary," Sanguinius replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "The Great Crusade's purpose is not merely to conquer worlds, but to unite humanity under the light of Imperial truth. What good is unity purchased with the ashes of those we sought to save?" The philosophical chasm between the 2 Primarchs yawned wide in the sudden silence. Around them, the assembled officers maintained their professional composure, yet the tension in the strategium had become almost tangible. Guilliman watched the exchange with the analytical detachment that marked his approach to all problems, his enhanced mind clearly calculating the long-term implications of this fundamental disagreement. The sound of armored footsteps, echoing through the corridor beyond, announced another arrival. The massive figure of Angron filled the doorway, the World Eater's Primarch's scarred features twisted into the perpetual scowl that the butcher's nails had carved into his transhuman flesh. Blood still stained his armor from whatever battlefield he had recently departed, and the psychic emanations of barely controlled rage preceded him like heat waves from a forge. "Pretty words," Angron growled, his voice carrying the harsh edge of neural implants that would never allow him true peace. The galaxy bleeds, and the angel speaks of compassion. His augmetic eyes swept across the assembled officers with undisguised contempt. The weak pray for mercy, the strong take what they will. Which are we, brothers? Sanguinius turned toward the newcomer, his perfect features showing no trace of the revulsion that most felt when confronted with Angron's rage-maddened presence. Instead, his dark eyes held depths of genuine sorrow for his damaged brother. "We are human," Sanguinius said quietly. "Enhanced, elevated, granted powers beyond the dreams of baseline mortality, but human nonetheless. And if we lose our humanity in the pursuit of conquest, then what exactly have we preserved?" Angron's laugh was a harsh bark that sent involuntary shivers through the mortal officers present. Humanity is a weakness to be burned away in the fires of war. The Emperor made us weapons, not philosophers. Use us as such. The confrontation might have escalated further, but the arrival of yet another figure forestalled any immediate violence. Magnus the Red materialized in the strategium, not through conventional entrance, but via the subtle manipulation of space itself, his towering form coalescing from ethereal mists that spoke of psychic mastery beyond mortal comprehension. The Crimson King's single eye surveyed the assembled Primarchs with depths of knowledge that seemed to encompass futures yet unwritten. "The die is cast," Magnus said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the merely physical. "The path chosen here will echo across the centuries to come. Choose wisely, my brothers, for the galaxy watches." Sanguinius studied his psychically gifted brother with intense concentration, searching those cryptic words for hidden meaning. "You have seen something in the tides of possibility?" "I have seen many things," Magnus replied, his tone carefully neutral. "But the future remains unwritten, shaped by the choices we make in moments such as these. The question that faces us is not whether we will conquer the galaxy, but what manner of conquerors we will prove ourselves to be." The weight of that observation settled over the strategium like a shroud drawn across the future itself. In the silence that followed, each Primarch contemplated the implications of the path they were being asked to choose. Rapid conquest purchased with blood, or gradual integration bought with patience and compassion. When Sanguinius spoke again, his voice carried the authority of absolute decision. "We proceed with the Cadian negotiations. Robute, I place you in charge of establishing the framework for gradual integration. Use their existing governmental structures where they serve the people well, replace them where they do not. The goal is unity, not uniformity." Horus's expression might have been carved from pale marble, so perfectly controlled was his reaction to the decision. Yet in the depths of his scarred features, something flickered that had not been present before Ulanor. A shadow of doubt, perhaps, or the first stirrings of a resentment that would find fertile ground in the empty places left by wounded pride. "As you command," he said, the formal words carrying an undertone that might have been resignation. "The sons of Horus stand ready to implement your will." Yet even as he spoke, the words of loyalty, those with the perception to read between the spoken and the unspoken, could sense the hairline fractures beginning to form in the bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. The angel of death bore his burden with grace and nobility, but burdens, no matter how nobly borne, change those who carry them. And in the darkness between the stars, ancient powers that fed upon discord and division stirred with the patient hunger of predators, sensing the first scent of weakness in their prey. The great crusade would continue, but it would follow a different path than the one that fate had originally decreed. Whether that path led to salvation or damnation remained to be written in the blood and choices of the days to come. Chapter 3. Seeds in fertile ground. The halls of the Fidelitas. Lex bore the weight of a legion's shame like a shroud draped across marble columns. In the depths of the Word-bearer's flagship, where shadows gathered thick as incense and the air itself seemed heavy with the burden of crisis, two figures moved through corridors that had once echoed with the triumphant hymns of imperial truth. Now those same passages whispered only with the soft susurrus of doubt and the bitter taste of divine rejection. Erebus walked with the measured pace of one whose faith had been tested in fires that burned hotter than any forge. The first chaplain's scarred features bore the marks of a soul that had looked into the abyss and found it looking back with hungry eyes. His dark robes rustled against the deck plates as he approached the sanctum where Cor Phaeron waited, the chamber that had once been dedicated to the worship of the Emperor as a god, but now served purposes that would have horrified the faithful. The chamber itself stood as a monument to transformation. Where once golden Aquilus had gleamed from every surface, now darker symbols crawled across the walls like living things. The eight-pointed star, the eye that wept tears of blood, the serpentine runes that spoke of powers older than human civilization. Each mark had been carved with reverent care by hands that had once raised hymns to the master of mankind, but now served hungers that fed on faith itself. Cor Phaeron knelt before the central altar, his augmetic limbs reflecting the pale light of ritual candles that burned with flames of unnatural colors. The first captain's weathered features were set in lines of deep contemplation, his lips moving in silent prayers to entities that dwelt in realms beyond the reach of mortal understanding. When he sensed Erebus's approach, he did not immediately turn, continuing his devotions for several more moments before acknowledging his fellow conspirator's presence. "The die has been cast," Cor Phaeron said, without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "The Emperor has chosen his path, and it is not the one we had prepared for." Erebus nodded, settling into the ritual position beside his superior with the fluid grace of long practice. "The angel of death bears the burden of command. Our original design lies in ruins, scattered like dust across the ceremonial grounds of Ulanor." The two word-bearers contemplated this development in the comfortable silence of shared understanding. For years beyond counting, they had whispered poison into the willing ear of their primarch, feeding his doubts about the Emperor's true nature while carefully nurturing his desperate need for divine purpose. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Lorgar would spread his crisis of faith to his favored son Horus. The inevitable war master would be corrupted through pride and ambition, and the galaxy would burn in the fires of civil war that would feed the dark gods for millennia to come. Yet now that careful design lay in shambles, undone by a single moment of imperial choice that had elevated not the proud and ambitious Horus, but the pure and noble Sanguinius to the position of supreme command. "The angel cannot be turned," Cor Phaeron observed, his augmetic fingers tracing patterns across the altar's dark surface. "His soul burns with light too pure for our masters to corrupt directly. Every divination, every casting of the bones, returns the same answer. He is beyond our reach while he remains true to himself." Erebus smiled, the expression carrying a weight of malevolent satisfaction that would have sent shivers through the spine of any loyal imperial observer. Perhaps, but pride is the downfall of angels, just as it was for Lucifer himself in the ancient texts. And wounded pride. He paused, savoring the implications like wine upon his tongue. Wounded pride is the most fertile ground of all for the seeds we would plant. The first chaplain rose from his kneeling position, his movements carrying the predatory grace of a hunting cat that had caught the scent of wounded prey. Horus Lupercal burns with resentment, like a forge left too long without proper tending. The rejection cuts deeper than any blade, precisely because it was so unexpected. He believed himself the inevitable choice, the destined inheritor of his father's authority. And now he must bow before his brother, Corferon added, his weathered features twisting into an expression of cruel satisfaction. Each time he offers formal acknowledgement of Sanguinius's authority, the wound opens afresh. Each strategic disagreement becomes not merely a matter of military doctrine, but a reminder of his own inadequacy in his father's eyes. The two conspirators began to pace around the central altar, their movements taking on the ritualistic quality that marked all their important deliberations. The candle flames flickered in response to their passage, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with independent malevolence across the carved walls. The approach must be subtle, Erebus mused, his mind already calculating the delicate threads of manipulation that would need to be woven. Horus is no fool, despite his wounded pride. Direct corruption would be detected and rejected. But suggestion, implication, the careful nurturing of existing doubts. The warrior lodges have already taken root within the lunar wolves, Corferon observed. Our brothers have done their work well. The seed of dissent has been planted among his officers, disguised as fraternal brotherhood and philosophical discourse. From there, it will be a simple matter to water that seed with carefully chosen words. Erebus paused in his pacing, a thought striking him with the force of divine inspiration. There is another element to consider. The Cadian negotiations that the angel favors over swift conquest. Horus sees them as weakness, as the triumph of sentiment over strategic necessity. We need only ensure that such negotiations fail spectacularly, that the costs of compassion are made manifest in blood and suffering. The implications of this observation sent a thrill of anticipation through both conspirators. The corruption of Horus would require not merely the exploitation of his wounded pride, but the careful orchestration of events that would validate his aggressive approach to warfare while discrediting Sanguinius's more measured methods. Our agents among the Cadian nobility can ensure that the negotiations collapse, Corferon said, his augmetic fingers flexing with mechanical precision. A few assassinations blamed on Imperial operatives, perhaps some manufactured evidence of treachery among the local leadership. The planet will revolt, and Gilliman's careful diplomatic work will turn to ash in his hands. And Horus will be there to offer the alternative, Erebus continued, his voice carrying the weight of prophetic certainty. Swift conquest, brutal efficiency, the kind of decisive action that his father once valued above all else. When the angel's compassion leads to disaster, who will the other Primarchs look to for guidance? The chamber fell silent, as both word-bearers contemplated the elegant cruelty of their design. Not the corruption of the pure, which lay beyond their power to achieve, but the elevation of the wounded and bitter to positions where their flaws would spread like cancer through the body of the Imperium itself. Yet even as they planned, deeper powers stirred in the spaces between reality and nightmare. The dark gods watched their mortal servants with the patient attention of immortal predators, their alien intellects calculating probabilities across timelines that stretched into infinity. The corruption of Horus was not merely desirable, but essential to their ultimate design. In the warp-touched reaches of his meditation chamber, Lorgar himself knelt before icons that would have been branded heretical by any loyal servant of the Imperium. The word-bearers, Primarch's perfect features, bore the weight of a crisis that had been building since that terrible day at Monarchia, when his father had stripped away the comfortable lies and forced him to confront the bitter truth of imperial doctrine. The Emperor was not a god. The Imperium was not a divine mandate. The Great Crusade was nothing more than the expansion of secular power wrapped in the trappings of manifest destiny. Everything that Lorgar had believed, everything he had built his legion's identity upon, had been revealed as delusion and self-deception. Yet in the depths of his despair, other whispers had begun to reach him. Voices that spoke of true divinity, of powers that did not deny their godhood but embraced it fully. The Chaos Gods offered what the Emperor had rejected: the acknowledgement of worship, the promise of transcendence, the validation of faith itself. "My sons," Lorgar whispered to the shadows that gathered around his kneeling form, "the path forward becomes clear at last. If the Emperor will not accept the worship he deserves, then we must find gods who will." Meanwhile, across the void between star systems, the object of all this careful planning remained unaware of the web being woven around him. Horus Lupercal stood upon the command deck of the Vengeful Spirit, his scarred features illuminated by the pale glow of tactical displays that showed the disposition of the Lunar Wolves' strike force. The campaign against the Melanthor Consortium proceeded with mechanical efficiency, each world falling before the advance of Imperial arms with the inexorable certainty of gravity itself. Yet for all the familiar rhythms of conquest, something fundamental had changed in the way Horus approached warfare. The easy confidence that had once marked his every decision had been replaced by a harder edge, a bitter determination that spoke of wounds that would not heal. His officers noted the change, but dared not comment upon it, recognizing in their Primarch's manner the signs of a predator, nursing its hurts while planning its revenge. The soft chime of an incoming Vox transmission drew Horus from his brooding contemplation. The holographic image that materialized before him bore the perfect features of his brother Sanguinius, the War Master's expression carrying depths of genuine concern that would have been touching under different circumstances. "Brother," Sanguinius said, his voice carrying clearly across the vast distances that separated their fleets. "I wanted to speak with you personally about the Melanthor situation. Your reports suggest that the campaign proceeds well, but I sense—" "You sense what?" Horus interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that would have been unthinkable before Ulanor. "Doubt in my methods? Concern about my tactical decisions? Or perhaps you question whether I am still capable of prosecuting a simple compliance action without supervision?" The hurt that flashed across Sanguinius's perfect features was immediate and profound. "Never that, my brother. I merely wish to ensure that you have all the support you require. If additional forces would—" "I require nothing," Horus cut him off again, his wounded pride flaring like a torch touched to oil. "The sons of Horus are capable of handling a few dozen primitive worlds without assistance. We are not so diminished that we require the Angel's intervention in every minor campaign." Sanguinius was silent for several moments, his dark eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that encompassed far more than this single conversation. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of brotherly affection, strained almost to the breaking point. "Horus, please. Do not let what happened at Ulanor poison the bond between us. Father made his choice for reasons that we may not fully understand, but that does not diminish your worth in his eyes or mine. You are still my brother, still one of the finest military minds in the Imperium." "Am I?" Horus replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Then why was I passed over? Why was the burden of command placed upon your shoulders rather than mine? What flaw did he see in me that escaped my notice?" The anguish in those questions cut through Sanguinius like a blade forged from purest regret. Yet before he could respond, before he could offer the comfort that his brother so desperately needed, The transmission cut out with the harsh static of severed connections. Horus had ended the conversation, leaving only empty space where understanding might have grown. In the silence that followed, dark whispers began to stir in the shadows of the Vengeful Spirit's command deck, voices too soft to be heard by mortal ears, suggestions too subtle to be recognized as external influence. The seeds of corruption had been planted in fertile ground, and now they began their slow but inexorable growth toward a harvest that would stain the galaxy red with blood and betrayal. The angel of death bore his burden with grace and nobility, but even angels could not save those who chose damnation over redemption. And in the depths of space, ancient powers that fed upon discord and despair began to smile with faces that had never known human warmth. Chapter 4. Brotherhood Strained. The Zerath system burned like a funeral pyre against the star-scattered darkness of the void. 3 months had passed since the combined fleet action that brought the stubborn worlds into compliance, yet the smoke of conquest still rose from a dozen crater-scarred continents where imperial truth had been imposed by blade and bolter. The campaign had been successful by any measure that mattered to the strategists and scribes who calculated the Great Crusade's advance. But for those who witnessed its prosecution, disturbing questions lingered in the spaces between official victory reports. Aboard the Red Tier, Sanguinius stood before the great observation deck's armored transparency, his perfect features cast in shadow by the dying light of worlds that would never again know peace. The War Master's ceremonial cloak hung still against his armored form, untroubled by any wind in the recycled atmosphere of the flagship's bridge. Yet those who served him closest could sense the tension that radiated from his transhuman frame, like heat from a forge left too long at full flame. Captain Askelon approached with the measured pace that marked all formal interactions with his Primarch, a data slate bearing the final casualty assessments clutched in his gauntleted hands. The sanguinary guard officer's features bore the stoic expression that had become habitual during these accounting sessions, though beneath that professional composure lay currents of unease that even enhanced transhuman psychology could not entirely suppress. "The final tallies, my lord," Askelon reported, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency that duty demanded. Zerath Prime, 18 billion souls lost. Zerath Secundus, 12 billion. The mining stations and orbital platforms. He paused, consulting the slate with obvious reluctance. Total system casualties approach 47 billion dead. Sanguinius received the report in silence, his dark eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that seemed to encompass the weight of every life recorded in those sterile numbers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality that had not been present before his elevation to the rank of War Master, a weariness that spoke of burdens no transhuman physiology had been designed to bear. 47 billion, he repeated, each syllable carrying the weight of lamentation. Nearly half the system's population, dead because they could not accept the Emperor's truth quickly enough to satisfy our timetables. From the shadows at the edge of the observation deck, another voice carried the harsh edge of barely controlled frustration. "They are dead because they chose resistance over reason," Horus Lupercal declared, stepping into the pale light that filtered through the armored transparency. The Lunar Wolves Primarch's scarred features bore an expression of grim satisfaction that would have been unthinkable in earlier days, when brotherhood and mutual respect had marked all interactions between the Emperor's sons. Sanguinius turned toward his approaching brother, noting with growing alarm the changes that had manifested over the course of the Zerath campaign. Horus moved with the same predatory grace that had always characterized his presence, yet something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. The easy confidence had been replaced by a harder edge, a bitter certainty that spoke of wounds that festered rather than healed. The Zerathi could have surrendered at any point during the siege of their primary hives, Horus continued, his voice carrying undertones of savage approval. Instead, they chose to fortify their cities with the bodies of their own children. What mercy do such creatures deserve? The philosophical chasm that had begun to open between the two Primarchs in the weeks following Ulanor now yawned wide enough to swallow worlds. Sanguinius regarded his brother with eyes that held depths of profound concern, searching those familiar features for some sign of the noble warrior who had once stood beside him in perfect brotherhood. "They deserve the chance to choose acceptance over destruction," Sanguinius replied, his voice remaining calm despite the growing tension between them. "The Great Crusade's purpose is not merely to eliminate resistance, but to bring the scattered children of humanity back into the fold of imperial truth. What use is unity purchased with the ashes of those we sought to save?" Horus's laugh was a harsh sound that carried no trace of genuine humor. "Unity comes through strength, brother, through the absolute certainty that defiance leads only to destruction. The Emperor understands this, even if his current war master has forgotten the lesson." The words struck like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage upon the bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. Around the observation deck, the assembled officers found sudden fascination with their instruments and displays, unwilling to witness the dissolution of brotherhood that played out before their enhanced senses. Sanguinius closed his eyes for a moment, his perfect features reflecting the weight of decisions that grew heavier with each passing day. When he opened them again, his dark gaze held depths of sorrow that encompassed far more than the immediate disagreement between them. "Horus," he said quietly, stepping closer to his brother, with movements that carried careful deliberation. "Something has changed in you since Ulanor. The brother I knew would never have spoken with such casual dismissal of human suffering. What troubles you?" For an instant, something flickered across Horus's scarred features that might have been vulnerability, a glimpse of the wounded soul that lay beneath the armor of bitter certainty. Yet before Sanguinius could reach out to offer the comfort that his brother so desperately needed, that moment of weakness vanished like smoke before a cold wind. "What troubles me," Horus replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is watching the Great Crusade slow to a crawl while its supposed leader mistakes sentiment for wisdom. The galaxy burns with the fires of rebellion and Xenos aggression, yet the Angel of Death counsels patience and negotiation." The accusation hung between them like a blade drawn in anger, its edge keen enough to sever bonds that had been forged in the crucible of brotherhood itself. Sanguinius felt the weight of that charge settle upon his shoulders like lead, each word a reminder of the impossible balance he struggled to maintain between duty and compassion. "The Cadian negotiations," he began, but Horus cut him off with a gesture that carried all the dismissive authority he had once wielded as the Emperor's most favored son. "The Cadian negotiations will fail," Horus declared with prophetic certainty. "Mark my words, brother. Your compassionate approach will collapse in blood and betrayal, and when it does, the other Primarchs will remember who counseled swift action and who advocated for weakness." The bitter certainty in those words sent a chill through Sanguinius that had nothing to do with the recycled atmosphere of the flagship's bridge. Yet before he could respond, before he could attempt to bridge the growing chasm between them, the soft chime of an incoming Vox transmission interrupted the confrontation. The holographic projection that materialized above the central display table bore the aquiline features of Robute Gilliman, The Ultramarine's Primarch's expression carrying news that would validate every fear and suspicion that had begun to grow in the space between brothers. "My Lord Warmaster," Guilliman said, his voice carrying across the void with formal precision, despite the weight of grave news. "I regret to report that the Cadian negotiations have collapsed. The planetary governor and his entire council were found dead in their chambers 3 hours ago, apparently killed by Imperial agents using classified assassination techniques." The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of ceremony, but the stunned absence of sound that follows the collapse of carefully laid plans. Sanguinius felt the weight of Horus's gaze upon him, like the heat from a forge fire. Though when he turned toward his brother, he found only an expression of grim vindication that chilled him more than any overt hostility could have managed. "The planet has declared universal rebellion," Guilliman continued, his analytical mind already calculating the implications of the disaster. "Every major city has risen in revolt. They claim that the Emperor's offer of negotiation was merely a ruse to position assassination squads within striking distance of their leadership. Estimated casualties for a forced compliance now exceed 12 billion souls." Horus stepped forward, his scarred features bearing an expression of bitter satisfaction that would have been unthinkable before the shadows began to whisper in the dark corners of his mind. "So much for the compassionate approach," he said, his voice carrying undertones of savage approval. How many billions might still be alive if the Warmaster had chosen swift conquest over prolonged negotiation? The accusation struck home with devastating precision, each word carefully calculated to exploit the guilt that Sanguinius carried for every life lost under his command. The Angel of Death stood silent for several heartbeats, his perfect features reflecting the weight of failure that no amount of nobility could entirely ease. Yet when he finally spoke, his voice carried the strength that had marked him since his first days as a military commander, tempered now by the wisdom that comes only through the bitter experience of command's true cost. "Then we will bear that burden," he said quietly, his words carrying clearly across the observation deck despite their soft tone. "Every life lost because of our failures, every soul that might have been saved by different choices. This is the price of leadership, brother. Not the glory of conquest, but the weight of consequence." From the edges of the observation deck, other figures began to materialize as word of the Cadian disaster spread through the fleet's command structure. Fulgrim approached with the fluid grace that marked all his movements, the Phoenician's perfect features bearing an expression of carefully controlled sympathy that carried undertones of calculated assessment. "My dear Sanguinius," Fulgrim said, his melodious voice carrying just the right note of concern to seem genuine. "Such a tragedy, but perhaps not an entirely unexpected one. The enemies of humanity are cunning beyond measure, always ready to exploit any sign of weakness or hesitation." The subtle implication in those words was not lost on any who heard them, though none dared give voice to the accusations that hung unspoken in the recycled air. Mortarion materialized from the shadows with the silent approach that marked his passage, the Death Guard Primarch's plague-scarred features bearing their perpetual expression of grim disapproval. "Words and treaties are tools for the weak," Mortarion declared, his sepulchral voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "The strong take what they will and hold it through force of arms. The Death Guard have never needed to negotiate with those marked for conquest." The gathering criticism struck at Sanguinius from multiple angles, each accusation carefully calculated to exploit the doubts that had begun to grow in the wake of the Cadian failure. Yet even as his brothers spoke their subtle words of condemnation, a new voice cut through the growing tension with the authority of deeper knowledge. Magnus the Red approached the assembled Primarchs with movements that seemed to bend reality around his towering form, the Crimson King's single eye blazing with psychic fires that illuminated truths hidden from lesser perception. When he spoke, his words carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the merely physical. "There are darker currents at work here than simple military failure," Magnus declared, his gaze moving between his assembled brothers with uncomfortable intensity. The warp itself grows troubled around these events, as if some malevolent intelligence guides them toward predetermined ends. Horus's reaction to this observation was immediate and visceral, though he controlled his expression with iron discipline born of decades of command. "More mysticism from our sorcerer brother," he said, his voice carrying an edge of dismissive contempt. "Perhaps the solution to our problems lies not in supernatural speculation, but in the simple application of proven military doctrine." Yet Magnus's enhanced perception caught something that escaped the notice of his physically focused brothers, a subtle dissonance in the warp currents around Horus that spoke of influences more ancient and malevolent than any mortal corruption. The Crimson King's features bore an expression of growing alarm as he recognized the telltale signatures of powers that dwelt in realms beyond human comprehension. "Brother," Magnus said, his voice carrying urgent warning. I must lead," Horus interrupted, his scarred features twisting into an expression of frustrated authority. "Something that seems to have been forgotten in all this talk of negotiation and supernatural influence. The Emperor chose Sanguinius as War Master, and I have sworn my loyalty to that choice. But loyalty does not require blind acceptance of flawed strategy." The open challenge in those words struck like lightning across the observation deck, illuminating in stark detail the fractures that had begun to appear in the bonds that held the Great Crusade together. Around the assembled Primarchs, mortal officers found sudden fascination with their instruments, unwilling to witness the breakdown of unity that had once seemed as eternal as the stars themselves. Sanguinius regarded his brother with eyes that held depths of sorrow beyond measure, recognizing in Horus's bitter words the echo of choices that could not be unmade. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, tempered by the compassion that marked all his interactions with those he loved. "Then speak your mind clearly, my brother. If you have counsel to offer, I would hear it. If you have strategy to propose, present it. But do not mistake disagreement for disloyalty or error for malice." The moment stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss, offering one last chance for understanding to triumph over the shadows that whispered in the spaces between brotherhood. Yet even as Sanguinius extended his hand in reconciliation, darker powers worked to ensure that chance would not be taken. In the depths of space around them, ancient intelligences that fed upon discord and division smiled with faces that had never known human warmth, recognizing in this moment the first fracture that would eventually shatter the Great Crusade itself. The Angel of Death had chosen compassion over conquest, but that choice would demand a price that even his noble heart might not prove strong enough to bear. And in the darkness between the stars, the laughter of thirsting gods echoed like thunder across the void. Chapter 5. The Lodges of Treachery. In the bowels of the vengeful spirit, where the thrumming of plasma conduits masked the whispered words that would reshape the galaxy, brotherhood took on meanings that the architects of the Great Crusade had never intended. The chamber that had once served as a training hall for Lunar Wolves' neophytes now bore the marks of ritual transformation, its walls carved with symbols that spoke of loyalties deeper than legion bonds and older than imperial law. Sergeant Tarek Torgadon knelt in the circle of his battle brothers, his scarred features illuminated by the pale glow of ritual flames that cast dancing shadows across the assembled warriors. Around him, nearly 24 Astartes maintained the positions of formal brotherhood, their enhanced frames forming a perfect ring that enclosed secrets too dangerous for the light of honest discourse. Each wore the wolf's head of the 16th Legion, yet the oaths they swore in this hidden place transcended the boundaries that had once seemed absolute. The warrior lodge had grown beyond anything its original members had anticipated when they first gathered to share concerns about the changing nature of their legion's role within the Great Crusade. What had begun as informal discussion among battle brothers had evolved into something far more organized, more purposeful, more dangerous to the established order that had guided the Imperium since its birth. "Brothers," Torgadon began, his voice carrying the weight of ritual authority that the lodge's customs demanded. "We gather once more to speak truths that cannot be voiced in the light of day, to share concerns that official channels would silence before they could reach ears capable of understanding." The response came in unison, 24 voices joining in the formal reply that had become sacred to their purposes. "We are bound by brotherhood deeper than blood, stronger than gene seed, more enduring than the flesh that houses our souls." From the shadows at the edge of the circle, a figure stepped forward, whose presence would have sent shockwaves through the Legion's command structure had his identity been known to those who maintained official loyalty. Hasta Sejanus, the Lunar Wolves' Mournival member, and one of Horus's most trusted advisors, bore the ritual markings that identified him not merely as a participant, but as one of the Lodge's guiding spirits. "The Cadian disaster weighs heavy upon our thoughts," Sejanus said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had stood beside the Primarch himself during countless campaigns. 12 billion souls lost because diplomacy was chosen over decisive action. How many more will die before wisdom reasserts itself over sentiment? The question struck at the heart of the doubts that had been growing within the Lunar Wolves ever since their father's elevation had been passed over in favor of the Angel of Baal. Around the circle, battle-tested veterans who had followed Horus across 100 worlds found themselves nodding in grim agreement with observations that would have been branded treasonous in any official forum. "The War Master's heart is noble," another voice added from the circle, that of Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, whose presence lent additional weight to the gathering's deliberations. Yet nobility without strength becomes mere weakness when faced with the brutal realities of galactic conquest. The Emperor chose poorly at Ulanor. The blasphemy inherent in those words would have drawn immediate censure in any loyal gathering, yet here in the hidden depths of the flagship, they were received not with shock, but with the solemn acknowledgement of bitter truth. The lodge provided sanctuary for thoughts too dangerous for conventional expression, a space where loyalty could be redefined according to principles that transcended blind obedience to flawed authority. From another section of the circle, the voice of Luke Sedirai carried the weight of tactical analysis that had served the Legion well during countless compliances. "Our father sees what the rest refuse to acknowledge. The galaxy cannot be conquered through negotiation and gentle persuasion. It bows only to strength, to the certainty of imperial truth backed by overwhelming force." Torgadon nodded slowly, his enhanced features reflecting the weight of decisions that grew heavier with each gathering of the lodge. "Then we must ask ourselves the question that official loyalty forbids. What is our duty when flawed leadership threatens not merely our legion, but the Great Crusade itself?" The silence that followed was not the comfortable quiet of shared understanding, but the pregnant pause that precedes commitments that cannot be unmade. Around the circle, Enhanced warriors who had sworn absolute loyalty to the Emperor and his chosen representatives found themselves contemplating the boundaries of that oath and the circumstances under which it might be transcended. Yet before any could give voice to the treasonous thoughts that stirred in the depths of their enhanced minds, the chamber's concealed entrance dilated to admit a figure whose presence transformed the nature of their gathering entirely. Erebus of the Word-Bearers stepped into the pale light of the ritual flames, his dark robes rustling against the deck plating as he approached the circle of kneeling warriors. The first chaplain's scarred features bore an expression of paternal satisfaction as he surveyed the assembled lunar wolves, recognizing in their troubled faces the fertile ground where seeds of greater purpose might take root. His dark eyes held depths of knowledge that encompassed far more than military doctrine or tactical theory, touching upon truths that dwelt in realms beyond mortal understanding. "Brothers of the 16th, Erebus said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely physical. Your concerns honor both your intelligence and your loyalty to the true purposes of the Great Crusade. The Emperor's vision requires leaders capable of making hard choices, of accepting necessary costs, of viewing the galaxy with clarity unclouded by sentiment or weakness." Torgadon regarded the word-bearer with the wary respect, due to one whose reputation preceded him, though something in the chaplain's manner sent subtle warnings through his enhanced nervous system. "You speak wisely, chaplain. Yet what counsel would you offer to warriors caught between loyalty to their Primarch and concern for the Crusade's future?" Erebus smiled, the expression carrying a weight of satisfaction that would have alarmed any observer with the perception to recognize its true nature. "I would suggest that true loyalty lies not in blind obedience to flawed authority, but in supporting those leaders whose vision aligns with the Emperor's original intent. Your father understands what the current War Master does not, that conquest requires strength, not compassion." The implications of those words struck the assembled warriors like lightning illuminating a storm-darkened sky. Around the circle, enhanced minds began to calculate possibilities that official doctrine would have branded treasonous, paths forward that honored the spirit of their oaths while transcending the letter of formal loyalty. "You speak of supporting our father," Sejanus said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of one who had learned to navigate dangerous political currents. "Yet how can such support be offered when he is bound by the decisions of higher authority?" "Authority flows from competence," Erebus replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When competence fails, when decisions lead to unnecessary disaster and death, then perhaps it becomes necessary to reconsider the source from which authority should flow." The chamber fell silent as the full implications of that observation settled upon the assembled warriors. They were discussing not merely disagreement with policy, but the fundamental question of whether the Emperor's choice at Ulanor had been correct, and what responsibilities such a potential error might place upon those with the vision to recognize it. Yet even as these dangerous thoughts took shape in the hidden chamber, their effects were already spreading beyond the confines of the vengeful spirit itself. Across the void, aboard the flagship Endurance, similar gatherings were taking place in spaces that official oversight would never reach. Captain Callas Typhon knelt within his own circle of brotherhood, the Death Guard officer's augmetic implants gleaming in the pale light of ritual flames that cast shadows across features marked by decades of chemical warfare. Around him, warriors who had followed Mortarion through the poisoned hellscapes of a dozen worlds found themselves questioning the wisdom of leadership that prioritized compassion over decisive action. "The 14th has always served without question," Typhon declared, his voice carrying the authority of one who had earned respect through blood and sacrifice. Yet service to flawed leadership serves neither the Legion nor the Great Crusade itself. Our Father sees clearly what others refuse to acknowledge, that strength alone commands respect in a galaxy that knows only war. From the shadows of the ritual circle, another voice carried the weight of bitter experience. The angel speaks of preserving life, yet how many more will die because crucial campaigns are delayed by negotiations that were doomed from the start? How many worlds will burn because swift conquest was rejected in favor of gradual integration? The question struck at the heart of doubts that had been growing within the Death Guard ever since the Cadian disaster had validated their Primarch's aggressive approach to warfare. The Lodge provided sanctuary for thoughts that official channels would silence, a space where loyalty could be redefined according to principles that transcended blind obedience to questionable authority. Meanwhile, aboard the Pride of the Emperor, Fulgrim's flagship, similar currents of dissent flowed through gatherings that bore the trappings of artistic appreciation, but served purposes that would have alarmed any loyal observer. The Phoenician sons gathered not merely to discuss aesthetic philosophy, but to question the wisdom of leadership that seemed to prioritize sentiment over the pursuit of perfection. Captain Lucius knelt within his own circle of brotherhood, his perfect features reflecting the pale glow of ritual flames as he voiced concerns that had begun to consume the 3rd Legion's officer corps. "Excellence demands the courage to make hard choices," he declared, his melodious voice carrying undertones of frustrated ambition. "The Emperor's vision cannot be achieved through compromise and negotiation. It requires leaders willing to pursue perfection, regardless of cost." The spread of these lodges across multiple legions represented not merely disagreement with policy, but the formation of an alternative power structure that drew its authority from shared conviction rather than formal hierarchy. Each gathering strengthened the bonds between warriors who questioned the wisdom of current leadership, creating networks of loyalty that transcended traditional Legion boundaries. Yet even as these dangerous currents spread through the Great Crusade's command structure, other voices began to speak in defense of established authority. Aboard the Invincible Reason, Lion L. Jonsson addressed his assembled officers with the authority of absolute conviction, his stern features reflecting the weight of loyalties that no amount of political pressure could shake. "The Emperor's choice at Ulanor was made with wisdom that transcends our limited understanding," the Lion declared, his voice carrying the authority of one whose loyalty had never wavered. "Sanguinius bears the burden of command with honor and nobility. The 1st Legion stands ready to support his decisions, regardless of their immediate popularity or apparent difficulty." The Dark Angels, Primarch's words carried across the void to reach ears that needed to hear such unwavering support, yet they also served to highlight the growing divisions within the Great Crusade's leadership structure. For every voice that spoke in support of the current War Master, 2 others whispered doubts about the wisdom of compassionate leadership in a galaxy that respected only strength. Back aboard the Red Tear, Sanguinius stood before the great tactical display that showed the disposition of forces across a dozen systems where the Great Crusade continued its advance. The Angel of Death's perfect features bore the weight of knowledge that official reports could not fully convey, awareness of currents of dissent that threatened to tear apart the unity that had made their victories possible. "The lodges spread," Captain Oskellen reported, his voice carrying the weight of intelligence that brought no comfort to those who heard it. "Lunar Wolves, Death Guard, Emperor's Children." The pattern repeats across multiple legions, warriors gathering in secret to question decisions made in the light of honest discourse. Sanguinius received this news in silence, his dark eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that encompassed far more than the immediate threat to his authority. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of wisdom earned through bitter experience of command's true cost. "They gather because they fear," he said quietly, his words carrying clearly despite their soft tone. "Fear that compassion is weakness, that mercy leads to disaster, that the preservation of life comes at the cost of victory itself. They are not entirely wrong in their concerns." The admission struck his assembled officers like a physical blow, each word carrying implications that threatened to undermine the very foundations of their loyalty. Yet before any could respond, Sanguinius continued with the authority of absolute conviction. "Yet they are entirely wrong in their solution. The lodges offer fellowship based upon shared doubt rather than shared purpose, unity purchased through the rejection of legitimate authority rather than the embrace of difficult truth. They mistake strength for cruelty and wisdom for weakness." Around the tactical display, the assembled officers found themselves nodding in grim acknowledgement of their Primarch's analysis. The lodges represented not merely disagreement with policy, but a fundamental challenge to the principles upon which the Great Crusade had been built. "What are your orders, my lord?" Ascaelon asked, his voice carrying the weight of one prepared to implement whatever response his Primarch deemed necessary. Sanguinius contemplated the question in silence, his perfect features reflecting the weight of decisions that would echo across the centuries to come. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute conviction, tempered by the compassion that marked all his interactions with those under his command. "We continue as we have," he said finally, "with honor, with nobility, with the certainty that right action will ultimately triumph over expedient brutality. The lodges will reveal their true nature in time, and when they do, we will be ready to respond with both justice and mercy." Yet even as he spoke those words of confidence, deeper currents stirred in the spaces between loyalty and betrayal. The warrior lodges had taken root in fertile ground, prepared by wounded pride and nurtured by careful manipulation. What had begun as discussion would soon flower into action, and when it did, the galaxy would learn the true cost of division among those who were meant to stand united against the darkness. In the hidden chambers where brotherhood was redefined according to principles older than imperial law, ancient powers that fed upon discord and betrayal began to smile with faces that had never known human warmth. The angel of death bore his burden with grace and nobility, but even angels could not save those who chose damnation over the difficult path of righteous duty. The Great Crusade continued its advance across the star-scattered darkness, yet the shadows that gathered in its wake grew deeper with each passing day. And in those shadows, the seeds of civil war took root in soil, watered with the blood of the innocent, and fertilized with the bitter tears of brotherhood betrayed. Chapter 6. The Istvan Gambit. The world of Istvan III turned beneath a sky the color of old blood, its industrial cities wreathed in the smoke of rebellion that had burned for 7 months without pause. From orbit, the planet appeared as a festering wound upon the flesh of the galaxy, its surface scarred by the kind of warfare that left nothing pure in its wake. Yet for all its ugliness, Istvan III served purposes that its defenders could never have imagined when they first raised their banners in defiance of imperial compliance. In the strategium of the vengeful spirit, Horus Lupercal stood before tactical displays that showed not the disposition of enemy forces, but the careful placement of his own troops across the planet's surface. The lunar wolves. Primarch's scarred features bore an expression of grim satisfaction as he contemplated arrangements that would have puzzled any observer unfamiliar with the true purpose of the Istvan campaign. Captain Tarik Torgadon's image flickered in the holographic display, his honest features bearing the strain of 7 months spent fighting an enemy that seemed to regenerate faster than it could be destroyed. Behind him, the ruins of Hive Coral stretched toward a horizon painted crimson by the light of burning promethium refineries. "My lord," Torgadon reported, his voice carrying clearly across the void, despite the interference of orbital bombardments. "The eastern sectors remain under enemy control. Captain Loken requests permission to withdraw his companies to more defensible positions." Horus nodded slowly, his expression reflecting none of the concern that such a request would have generated in earlier campaigns. "Denied. Captain Loken will maintain his current positions regardless of casualties. The integrity of our deployment is essential to the operation's success." Something flickered across Torgadon's features that might have been confusion, though duty prevented him from voicing the questions that clearly troubled his enhanced mind. "As you command, my lord. The 10th Company stands ready to reinforce if—" "The 10th Company will remain in reserve," Horus interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of authority that brooked no discussion. "Captain Loken's forces are sufficient for their assigned objectives." The transmission ended with the harsh static of severed connections, leaving Horus alone with the tactical displays that revealed the true nature of his design. Across the planet's surface, the most loyal elements of the Lunar Wolves had been deployed in positions that offered maximum exposure to enemy fire while providing minimal support from their brothers. Each placement had been calculated with the precision of a master tactician, yet the goal was not victory, but elimination. From the shadows at the edge of the strategium, a voice carried the weight of shared purpose and dark satisfaction. "The arrangements proceed according to plan," Erebus observed, stepping into the pale light cast by the holographic projections. The word-bearer's scarred features bore an expression of paternal approval as he studied the dispositions that would soon serve purposes far removed from conventional warfare. Horus turned toward his ally with movements that carried the predatory grace of a hunting cat that had finally cornered its prey. The transformation that had been building over the months since Ulanor was now complete, written in the hard lines of his features, and the cold fire that burned behind his pale eyes. "Loken, Torgadon, Varvarus," Horus said, each name falling from his lips like a funeral dirge. "The most loyal, the most noble, the most blindly devoted to ideals that have no place in the galaxy as it truly exists. They serve best as examples of the cost of misplaced faith." Erebus smiled with satisfaction that would have chilled the blood of any loyal observer. "The virus canisters are in position. When you give the word, every trace of opposition to your rightful authority will be cleansed from the Legion's ranks. The weak will perish, and the strong will emerge purified by the flames of necessary truth." The moment stretched between them like a bridge across an abyss, offering one last chance for mercy to triumph over the systematic brutality that had been so carefully planned. Yet that chance had died months ago, in the hidden chambers where warrior lodges redefined loyalty, according to principles that transcended imperial law. Horus raised his hand, the gesture carrying the weight of absolute authority over life and death. When he spoke, his voice carried across the void to reach ears that waited for the signal that would transform rebellion into atrocity. "Begin the cleansing." The response was immediate and horrific in its efficiency. Across Istvan, the Third's ravaged surface, concealed virus bombers screamed down from the upper atmosphere, their holds packed with canisters of death that had been prepared in the deepest laboratories of the Mechanicum. The life-eater strain that spilled from those containers was not designed to kill quickly or cleanly, but to consume everything it touched with the ravenous hunger of accelerated decay. On the surface of Hive Coral, Captain Garviel Loken felt the first stirrings of alarm as his enhanced senses detected atmospheric changes that spoke of something far worse than conventional bombardment. Around him, the warriors of the Lunar Wolves' most loyal companies continued their advance against enemy positions, unaware that death approached not from the weapons of their foes, but from the sky above their heads. "Contact the fleet," Loken ordered, his voice carrying urgently across the tactical network. "Something is wrong with the orbital support patterns. The bombardment vectors are—" His words died in his throat as the first virus bombs detonated across the battlefield, releasing clouds of microscopic death that spread with the inexorable certainty of natural law. The Life-Eater virus consumed everything it touched, reducing proud Astartes warriors to pools of organic sludge in the space of heartbeats. Armor meant nothing. Enhancement meant nothing. Loyalty meant nothing in the face of weapons designed to eliminate the very concept of organic life. Loken's last transmission carried across the void with the clarity of absolute horror. "My lord, why?" The question received no answer, because none could be given that would satisfy the dying or comfort the bereaved. The virus bombing of Istvan III was not strategy but butchery, not military necessity, but the systematic elimination of those whose loyalty had made them obstacles to ambitions that transcended imperial law. Within hours, the planetary surface that had once echoed with the sound of battle fell silent, save for the wind that carried the stench of decay across continents transformed into charnel houses. The most loyal elements of 4 entire legions had been reduced to organic waste, their only crime the steadfast devotion to oaths that their primarchs had decided to abandon. Aboard the Red Tier, flagship of the Blood Angels Legion, Sanguinius received the initial reports with the stunned incomprehension of one witnessing the collapse of everything he had believed absolute. The Angel of Death stood before the great observation deck's armored transparency, his perfect features reflecting depths of horror that no amount of transhuman conditioning could entirely suppress. "Confirm the reports," he commanded, though his voice carried the hollow quality of one who already knew the truth, but desperately sought reasons to doubt it. "The entire Lunar Wolves deployment?" Captain Ascalon's response carried the weight of intelligence that brought no comfort to those who heard it. "Confirmed, my lord. Virus bombing across 12 separate operational zones. Estimated casualties exceed 80,000 Astartes, with complete elimination of loyalist elements within the Lunar Wolves, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters formations." The numbers struck like physical blows, each casualty figure representing not merely a statistical loss, but the death of warriors whose only fault had been unwavering loyalty to oaths their primarchs had abandoned. Sanguinius closed his eyes for several moments, his enhanced senses struggling to process the scale of betrayal that had just been revealed. When he opened them again, his dark gaze held depths of sorrow that encompassed the weight of brotherhood irreparably shattered. "And Horus?" "Still in orbit above Istvan III, Ascaelon replied, his voice carrying careful neutrality despite the implications of that intelligence. "No response to our communications. His fleet maintains defensive formations that suggest he is no longer our brother," Sanguinius finished, the words falling from his lips like drops of poison. "Summon the Council of War. Alert all loyal primarchs to converge on our position immediately. The Great Crusade has ended, and something far darker has taken its place." The response to that summons came with the swift efficiency that had marked all great gatherings during the glory days of imperial expansion. Yet now those same patterns served purposes that would have been unthinkable before the virus bombs fell. Within days, the most powerful fleet concentration since Ulanor had assembled in the outer reaches of the Istvan system, their combined firepower sufficient to crack worlds and darken stars. Lionel Johnson arrived first, the Dark Angel's fleet emerging from the warp with the precise timing that had marked all their operations since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. The Lion's stern features bore an expression of grim determination as his image appeared in the Red Tier's primary communications chamber. "My Lord Warmaster," he said, the formal address carrying weight that transcended mere protocol. "The First Legion stands ready to enforce your will upon those who have forgotten their oaths." Robert Gilliman materialized in the holographic display moments later, his analytical features bearing the strain of one whose careful plans had been shattered by developments that no amount of strategic calculation could have predicted. "The Ultramarines bring 200,000 Astartes to your banner, brother. Whatever madness has claimed our brothers must be stopped before it spreads further." Other loyal Primarchs added their voices to the growing chorus of support, each pledge of loyalty carrying the weight of legions that had remained true to their original purpose, despite the corruptions that had claimed their brothers. Vulcan, Dawn, Corax, Ferrus Monus, each brought strength that might yet prove sufficient to contain the cancer that had begun to consume the Great Crusade from within. Yet even as loyal forces gathered in response to Sanguinius's call, darker powers were already moving to ensure that the confrontation would not end with simple victory for either side. In the warp-touched depths of his flagship, Horus knelt before icons that would have been branded heretical by any loyal servant of the Imperium, his transformation now complete and terrible to behold. The pale Primarch, who had once been the Emperor's most favored son, now bore marks of corruption that spoke of allegiances older and more terrible than imperial law. His armor had been reworked with symbols that hurt to look upon, his weapons blessed with the kind of power that could only be purchased through the sacrifice of innocent blood. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the merely physical, each word weighted with authority that transcended mortal understanding. "Brothers," he said to the assembled images of Primarchs who had chosen to follow him into damnation. The false Warmaster gathers his forces for one final battle. Let him come. We shall show him the price of standing against the will of gods. Angron's image flickered in the display. The World Eaters. Primarch's features twisted into an expression of savage anticipation that the butcher's nails had carved into his transhuman flesh. The 12th Legion thirsts for loyalist blood. Give us targets, and we will paint the void red with their essence. Mortarion's sepulchral voice followed, carrying the weight of conviction purchased through years of bitter contemplation. The Death Guard brings strength that no loyal force can match. We have embraced truths that the weak-minded call corruption, and in that embrace we have found power beyond measure. Fulgrim's melodious tones completed the chorus of damnation, his perfect features bearing an expression of cruel satisfaction that would have sent shivers through any observer with the perception to recognize its true nature. The Emperor's children have transcended the limitations that bind lesser warriors to outdated concepts of loyalty and honor. We serve purposes higher than imperial law. The gathering of traitor Primarchs represented power sufficient to challenge the very foundations of the Imperium itself, yet their strength came not merely from military might, but from the dark blessings that flowed from realms beyond human understanding. They had chosen damnation over duty, yet in that choice they had found strength that loyal forces might not prove capable of matching. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not merely the fate of the Great Crusade, but the direction of human evolution across the galaxy. Brother would face brother in battles that would stain the void with blood and illuminate the darkness with the fire of dying worlds. Sanguinius stood at the center of gathering storm clouds, his perfect features reflecting the weight of choices that could not be unmade and consequences that would echo across eternity. The angel of death had sought to preserve unity through compassion, yet now he faced the bitter necessity of enforcing loyalty through strength. In the depths of space between them, ancient powers that fed upon discord and betrayal began to stir with anticipation that had been building since the first seeds of corruption were planted in fertile ground. The galaxy would burn in the fires of civil war, and from those flames would emerge either salvation or damnation for the species that had dared to claim dominion over the stars. The Istvan Gambit had been played, and now the price of that terrible game would be paid in blood that could never be washed clean from the hands of those who shed it. Chapter 7. Angels and Demons. The Perditus system hung in the void like a string of pearls cast across velvet darkness, its 7 worlds bearing the scars of humanity's first steps into the galaxy during the early years of the Great Crusade. For 2 centuries, these worlds had known peace under the aegis of imperial law, their populations growing prosperous through trade routes that connected the galactic core to the frontier territories where compliance actions still raged. Yet now those same trade routes served as highways for armies bent upon fratricidal destruction, their peaceful purpose perverted into channels for the movement of forces that would paint the void red with loyalist blood. Sanguinius stood upon the command bridge of the Red Tier, his perfect features illuminated by the pale glow of tactical displays that showed the disposition of the largest fleet concentration since the triumph at Ulanor. Around him, the combined might of 6 loyal legions stretched across the star-scattered darkness, their vessels bearing the heraldry of warriors who had remained true to their original oaths despite the corruption that had claimed their brothers. The Blood Angels' fleet formed the center of the Loyalist formation, their crimson-hulled vessels flanked by the bone-white ships of the Dark Angels and the blue and gold of the Ultramarines. Each fleet brought strength that had been proven across 100 worlds, yet now that same strength would be tested against enemies who bore the faces of brothers, and fought with powers drawn from realms beyond human understanding. Contact from the advanced scouts, Captain Askelon reported, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency that duty demanded, despite the weight of intelligence that brought no comfort to those who heard it. The traitor fleet has emerged from the warp at the system's edge. Configuration suggests substantial modification to their vessels. Sanguinius received this news with the stoic acceptance of one who had learned to expect the worst from every development in this conflict that should never have been necessary. Modifications of what nature? The response carried implications that challenged everything the Loyalists thought they understood about the capabilities of their former brothers. Unknown technologies, my lord. Hull configurations that appear to violate standard engineering principles. Energy signatures that our tech priests describe as unnatural. From the shadows at the edge of the command bridge, Lionel Jonsson stepped forward with the measured pace that marked all his interactions with his fellow Primarchs. The Dark Angels, Primarch's stern features, bore an expression of grim determination that had hardened over the months since Istvan III had revealed the true scope of their brother's betrayal. We suspected that Horus had embraced powers beyond imperial understanding, the Lion observed, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. Now we face the consequences of that choice. Whatever modifications they have made to their ships, whatever allies they have embraced, we must meet them with the strength of righteous purpose. Robert Gilliman materialized in the holographic display that connected the various fleet elements, his analytical features bearing the strain of one whose careful calculations had been shattered by variables that no strategic doctrine could have predicted. The traitor formations suggest coordination beyond normal fleet protocols, he reported, his voice carrying across the void with characteristic precision. They move with purpose that transcends individual Legion capabilities. The implications of that observation struck the assembled commanders with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. Each loyal Primarch had hoped that their fallen brothers retained enough of their original nature to be predictable, manageable, perhaps even redeemable. Yet the evidence mounting with each passing hour suggested that such hopes had been naive beyond measure. Sanguinius closed his eyes for several moments, his enhanced senses reaching out across the void to touch upon currents of possibility that flowed like tides through the warp itself. When he opened them again, his dark gaze held depths of knowledge that encompassed futures both terrible and magnificent, visions of sacrifice that would determine the fate of species, yet unborn. They come not as the brothers we once knew, he said quietly, his words carrying clearly across the command bridge, despite their soft tone. They come as vessels for powers that hunger for the destruction of everything we have sought to build. This battle will determine not merely the fate of the Great Crusade, but the future of human civilization itself. The weight of that pronouncement settled over the assembled officers like a shroud drawn across the future, each word carrying implications that transcended the immediate tactical situation. Around the bridge, enhanced warriors who had faced the horrors of a dozen campaigns found themselves contemplating threats that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. Yet before any could respond to their War Master's ominous assessment, the tactical displays flickered with new data that transformed strategic theory into brutal reality. The traitor fleet had begun its advance, their modified vessels moving through space with patterns that hurt to observe directly. "By the throne," whispered a tech priest whose augmetic sensors had been calibrated to perceive energies across the full electromagnetic spectrum. The signatures? They're not following standard warp drive protocols. Something else propels them, something that exists outside our understanding of physics itself. The answer to that mystery came with the arrival of Magnus the Red's psychic projection, the Crimson King's towering form materializing in the command center, with an urgency that spoke of knowledge too terrible for conventional transmission. His single eye blazed with psychic fires that illuminated truths hidden from lesser perception. "Brothers," Magnus declared, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the merely physical. "What approaches is not merely a fleet of corrupted legions. They bear the blessings of powers that dwell in realms where thought becomes reality and will reshapes the fundamental laws of existence. They bring demons." The word struck like lightning across the command bridge, illuminating in stark detail the true nature of the threat that approached through the star-scattered darkness. Around the assembled officers, decades of Imperial indoctrination warred with the evidence of their enhanced senses as they struggled to process the implications of warfare that transcended the boundaries between material reality and nightmare itself. Sanguinius felt the weight of prophetic visions pressing against his consciousness like flood waters held back by a crumbling dam. In those glimpses of possible futures, he saw himself standing upon a bridge of bone and shadow, his perfect features twisted by the kind of rage that could shatter worlds. He saw the black rage spreading through his legion like wildfire through dry timber, transforming noble warriors into berserkers whose only purpose was the spilling of blood. "Then we fight monsters," he said finally, his voice carrying the strength that had marked him since his first days as a military commander. "We fight them with the same courage that has carried us across the galaxy, the same determination that has brought 1,000 worlds into compliance. We fight them because that is what the Emperor expects of his sons." The battle that followed would be remembered in the histories of a dozen legions as the day that warfare transcended the boundaries of rational understanding and entered realms where the laws of physics bowed before the will of entities that had never known human limitations. The first exchange of fire between the fleets lit space with energies that burned with colors that had no names, weapons that fired projectiles composed of crystallized malice, and shells that screamed with the voices of the damned. Aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus Lupercal stood before displays that showed not tactical information, but ritual configurations that would have driven sane minds to madness through their sheer impossibility. The Primarch, who had once been the Emperor's most favored son, now bore marks of corruption that spoke of allegiances purchased through the sacrifice of everything he had once held sacred. His armor had been reworked with symbols that hurt to perceive directly, each marking carved with substances that existed only in the spaces between reality and nightmare. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who commanded not merely mortal warriors, but entities whose very existence violated the natural order. "Now they see," Horus declared to the assembled images of his traitor brothers. "Now they understand the price of standing against powers that transcend imperial comprehension. Let the false warmaster witness what he has chosen to oppose." The response came not from his brothers, but from presences that dwelt in realms beyond human understanding, voices that spoke in harmonies that bypassed the ears entirely and carved themselves directly into the consciousness of all who heard them. The Chaos Gods themselves had turned their attention to this battle, recognizing in it the first test of whether their chosen champion could deliver the galaxy into their eternal embrace. Back aboard the Red Terror, Sanguinius felt the first stirrings of the Black Rage as demons began to manifest across the fleet's battle line. The genetic curse that lay dormant within every blood angel responded to the presence of entities whose very existence represented everything that noble warriors had been created to oppose. Around the ship's corridors, crimson-armored figures began to succumb to visions of their Primarch's death, their enhanced minds fracturing under the weight of prophetic knowledge that had never been meant for mortal understanding. "My lord," Captain Azkaelan reported, his voice carrying the strain of one whose greatest fear had suddenly become manifest reality. The rage spreads. 3 companies report total communication breakdown. They advance on demon positions with no regard for tactical coordination. Sanguinius nodded grimly, recognizing in this development the fulfillment of visions that had haunted his dreams since childhood. Then let them advance, channel their fury toward worthy targets. The enemy brings horrors that deserve nothing but destruction. The battle that raged across the Purditus system defied every convention of warfare that had been established during 2 centuries of imperial expansion. Demon engines materialized in the void between fleets, their hulls composed of substances that existed only through the will of malevolent intelligences. Traitor Astartes fought with weapons that fired ammunition composed of crystallized screams and bolter shells that carried fragments of human souls. Yet for all the supernatural horror that the enemy brought to bear, the loyalist forces answered with courage that transcended mortal limitations. Sanguinius led boarding actions against demon vessels whose corridors twisted through dimensions that existed outside conventional geometry. His sword blazed with light that burned away shadows older than human civilization, each strike carrying the weight of nobility that refused to bow before any force that threatened innocent life. Guilliman's tactical genius adapted to warfare that violated every principle of strategic doctrine, his analytical mind finding patterns in chaos that allowed loyal forces to strike where the enemy's supernatural advantages could not protect them. The Ultramarines fought with coordination that transformed individual courage into overwhelming collective strength. Lionel Johnson led his Dark Angels in surgical strikes against traitor command vessels, their plasma weapons carving through demon hulls with energies that burned hotter than stellar cores. The First Legion's warriors maintained the stoic discipline that had marked them since the earliest days of the Great Crusade, their loyalty to their original oaths proving stronger than any corruption the enemy could offer. The battle reached its climax when Sanguinius himself descended into the heart of a demon ship, whose interior existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. In corridors that folded back upon themselves, and chambers where gravity flowed like liquid, the Angel of Death confronted horrors that had been spawned in the deepest reaches of the warp. The demon that rose to meet him bore the face of perfection, twisted beyond recognition, its features combining angelic beauty with malevolence, so pure that looking upon it directly caused physical pain. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that resonated in the space between heartbeats. Sanguinius, it whispered, each syllable dripping with false sweetness. The angel who would play at being a war master. You cannot save them. You cannot save anyone. Your death has been foretold since the moment of your creation. The Angel of Death raised his blade, its edge blazing with light that made the demon recoil despite its supernatural nature. Perhaps, he replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of absolute conviction. But I can ensure that my death serves a purpose worthy of the sacrifice. The duel that followed would be remembered in the annals of both sides as the moment when nobility confronted corruption in its purest form. Sanguinius fought not merely for victory, but for the preservation of everything that made humanity worth saving. His sword carved through demon flesh that reformed with each strike, his movements flowing with the grace of one who had accepted his fate while refusing to surrender to it. Around them, the battle raged with intensity that threatened to crack the barriers between reality and nightmare. Blood Angels succumbed to the black rage in ever greater numbers, their berserker fury tearing through demon ranks with ferocity that made even entities spawned in the warp itself recoil in horror. Yet as the tide of battle shifted toward loyalist victory, the price of that triumph became clear to all who witnessed it. Thousands of noble warriors lay dead or dying, their lives sacrificed to hold back forces that should never have been allowed to manifest in reality. The galaxy had glimpsed the true face of the enemy that now opposed the Imperium, and that knowledge would haunt the dreams of survivors for generations yet to come. Sanguinius emerged from the demon ship's death throes, bearing wounds that would never fully heal, his perfect features marked by scars that spoke of contact with entities whose very existence violated natural law. Around him, the Perditus system burned with fires that would take decades to extinguish, its worlds transformed into monuments to the cost of standing against the powers of chaos. The Loyalists had won their first major victory against the traitor forces, yet none who participated in that triumph could claim that victory had come without cost that challenged the very foundations of everything they fought to protect. The war that had begun with the virus bombing of Istvan III had revealed its true nature at last, and that revelation filled even the most courageous hearts with dread for battles yet to come. In the depths of space around them, ancient powers that fed upon the pain of mortals smiled with satisfaction at carnage that exceeded even their most optimistic projections. The galaxy would burn in the fires of civil war, and from those flames would emerge either salvation or damnation for the species that had dared to claim dominion over the stars themselves. The angel of death had faced his prophetic visions and emerged victorious, yet the cost of that victory would echo across the centuries like thunder in the void. Chapter 8. The Siege of Terra. Terra turned beneath skies the color of spilled blood, the cradle of humanity transformed into a fortress that bore the scars of preparations that had consumed years of desperate labor. From the highest spires of the Imperial Palace to the deepest foundations carved into the planet's bedrock, every surface bristled with weapons whose power could crack moons and darken stars. Yet for all the defensive preparations that mortal ingenuity could devise, none who gazed upon the red-stained heavens could doubt that the final battle for humanity's future was about to begin. The Astronomican's light flickered like a candle flame, assaulted by winds from beyond the conceptual horizon, its psychic beacon struggling to maintain coherence against the warp storms that preceded the approaching traitor fleet. In the depths of the palace, where the Emperor of mankind had labored for years beyond counting to unlock the secrets of the Eldari webway, ancient machinery groaned under stresses that threatened to tear reality itself apart at the seams. Sanguinius stood upon the highest battlements of the palace's outer walls, his perfect features illuminated by the pale glow of defense lasers that stretched across the Terran night sky like a web of burning stars. The War Master's ceremonial cloak hung motionless in the recycled atmosphere, yet those who served him closest could sense the tension that radiated from his transhuman frame, like heat from a forge approaching critical temperature. Around him, the combined might of the Loyalist legions had been deployed with the precision that marked all great defensive actions, yet the scope of the threat they faced challenged every conventional understanding of siege warfare. This would not be a battle for territory or resources, but a struggle for the very soul of human civilization itself. Captain Azkellan approached with data slates bearing intelligence that had been purchased with the lives of scout ships whose crews would never see another dawn. "The enemy fleet emerges from the warp at the system's edge," he reported, his voice carrying the weight of information that would reshape the nature of warfare itself. Configuration suggests. He paused, consulting instruments whose readings defied rational interpretation. "My lord, the vessels appear to have been fused with entities that exist outside conventional reality." Sanguinius received this news with the grim acceptance of one who had learned to expect the impossible from enemies who had embraced powers beyond mortal comprehension. "Show me." The tactical display that materialized before them bore images that challenged the sanity of all who viewed them directly. The traitor fleet advanced through space not as conventional vessels, but as living amalgamations of metal and flesh, their hulls writhing with movements that spoke of intelligence that had never known human limitations. Demon engines the size of battle cruisers swam through the void like predatory leviathans, their forms shifting between dimensions with casual disregard for the laws that governed material reality. At the center of this nightmare armada, the vengeful spirit led the advance like a dark star, whose light brought only corruption and despair. The flagship that had once been the pride of the Lunar Wolves now bore modifications that hurt to perceive directly, its hull carved with symbols that bled shadows into the space around them. "Estimated time to orbital engagement?" Sanguinius asked, though his voice carried the hollow quality of one who already knew that conventional calculations had become meaningless. "The enemy approaches not through normal space, but via routes that exist partially in the warp. Ascaelon replied, his enhanced senses struggling to process data that violated every principle of naval doctrine. Estimated arrival. They could translate into Terra orbit at any moment. From the shadows at the edge of the battlements, a figure approached, whose presence carried the weight of authority that transcended rank or protocol. Rogel Dawn stepped into the pale light cast by the defense lasers, his scarred armor bearing fresh marks from the fortification work that had consumed every moment since the first reports of traitor fleet movements had reached the throne world. "The outer defense grid stands ready," Dawn reported, his voice carrying the absolute confidence of one whose preparations had never failed to hold against any assault. Orbital platforms armed with weaponry that can crack continents, ground-based batteries whose targeting systems have been blessed by the finest tech priests of Mars. Whatever comes through that warp storm will face firepower sufficient to stop any conventional fleet. Sanguinius regarded his brother with eyes that held depths of knowledge, purchased through visions too terrible for comfortable contemplation. "Yet this is not a conventional fleet, my brother. What approaches Terra carries blessings that make conventional weapons seem like children's toys." The weight of that observation settled over the assembled officers like a shroud drawn across hope itself, each word carrying implications that challenged everything they thought they understood about the capabilities of Imperial defenses. Around the battlements, enhanced warriors who had stood guard over humanity's birth world for generations found themselves contemplating threats that existed beyond the boundaries of rational warfare. Before any could respond to their Primarch's ominous assessment, the very air around them began to thrum with resonances that bypassed the ears entirely and carved themselves directly into the consciousness of all who felt them. Deep beneath the palace, in chambers that had been sealed since the earliest days of Imperial construction, something stirred that had not moved for millennia. The Emperor of mankind rose from the golden throne with movements that sent shockwaves through dimensions that existed beyond mortal perception. For years, beyond counting, he had labored in the depths of the palace to unlock secrets that would free humanity from its dependence upon the dangerous currents of warp travel. The Webway project had consumed his attention so completely that the affairs of the galaxy had seemed distant echoes of concerns that paled before the promise of liberation from chaos itself. Yet now that great work lay in ruins, its mechanisms shattered by the psychic backlash of conflicts that had torn the warp itself apart, the Emperor's perfect features bore the weight of failure that no amount of divine authority could entirely ease. Yet his golden eyes blazed with power that could reshape reality itself through will alone. When he emerged onto the palace battlements, his presence transformed the nature of the approaching conflict entirely. The defense lasers that had seemed formidable moments before now appeared as mere candles before the solar fire of his psychic might. Around him, the assembled officers felt the weight of being in the presence of one whose power transcended the boundaries between the material realm and the realm of pure thought. "My son," the Emperor said, his voice carrying clearly despite the howling of warp storms that raged across Terran space. "The hour of testing has arrived. What approaches Terra seeks not merely conquest, but the corruption of everything we have sought to build." Sanguinius knelt before his father with movements that carried the weight of absolute reverence. Yet when he raised his perfect features to meet that golden gaze, his dark eyes held determination that no amount of prophetic knowledge could shake. "We stand ready to defend Terra to the last breath. Father," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the battlements, despite the growing chaos in the skies above. "Whatever the cost, humanity's birth world will not fall to the powers of chaos." The Emperor placed a gauntleted hand upon his son's shoulder, the gesture carrying affection that he rarely displayed before others. "The cost will be higher than you know," he said quietly, his words pitched for Sanguinius's ears alone. "Yet some prices must be paid, if anything of worth is to survive what comes." Before father and son could continue their exchange, the tactical displays flickered with new data that transformed strategic theory into immediate crisis. The traitor fleet had begun its final approach to Terra, their demon-infused vessels translating into real space with energies that made the planet's magnetic field writhe like a living thing. The first exchange of fire between the orbital defense platforms and the enemy fleet lit space with energies that had not been seen since the birth of stars themselves. Lance batteries fired beams of coherent light that could melt through armor plating, measured in kilometers. Yet these weapons struck demon hulls that absorbed such energies and transformed them into fuel for powers that existed beyond physical law. Macro-cannon shells the size of hab blocks struck enemy vessels and passed through them as if they were composed of nothing more substantial than shadow and malice. Torpedo salvos that should have reduced any conventional fleet to expanding clouds of superheated plasma simply vanished into dimensional rifts that opened like hungry mouths in the space around the traitor ships. "The defense platforms report minimal effect on enemy formations," came the voice of Admiral Kryn from the Naval Command Center, his words carrying across the command network with the strain of one whose greatest fears were being realized in real time. "Energy weapons appear to feed their power rather than deplete it. Kinetic bombardment passes through their hulls without causing structural damage." Sanguinius felt the weight of prophetic visions pressing against his consciousness like floodwaters held back by a crumbling dam. In those glimpses of possible futures, he saw Terra's skies filled with demon engines, whose very presence poisoned the air that billions of souls needed to breathe. He saw the Imperial Palace reduced to rubble beneath the tread of entities that had been spawned in the deepest reaches of the warp. Yet he also saw himself standing upon a bridge of bone and shadow, his sword blazing with light that could burn away the darkness itself. He saw the moment of choice that would determine whether humanity's future lay in salvation or eternal damnation. "Deploy the custodians," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute decision. "Release the Sisters of Silence. Whatever advantages the enemy gains through supernatural power, we counter with forces specifically created to oppose such threats." The response to that order came with the efficiency that had marked all great deployments since the earliest days of the Imperium. From the deepest vaults of the palace, the Adeptus Custodes emerged in formations that had not been seen since the Unification Wars themselves. Each Guardian wore armor, worked with technologies that predated the Great Crusade, their weapons blessed with the kind of power that could only be granted by the Emperor's direct intervention. The Sisters of Silence followed, their psychic nullification fields creating zones of absolute quiet in the warp that no demon could penetrate. Where they walked, the supernatural advantages that the traitor forces had relied upon simply ceased to function, replaced by the brutal realities of conventional warfare. Yet even as these elite forces took their positions throughout the palace defenses, the enemy continued their inexorable advance toward the planet's surface. Demon engines materialized in Terra's upper atmosphere with discharges of energy that lit the sky like artificial auroras. Drop pods that screamed with the voices of the damned began their descent toward the outer palace walls. The first traitor forces to make planetfall bore the heraldry of the Sons of Horus, yet their armor had been modified with substances that existed only through the will of malevolent intelligences. When they moved, shadows followed them that carried hints of spaces between dimensions, where thought became reality, and reality bent before the force of will. Angron descended from orbit not in a conventional drop pod, but as a falling star, whose passage through the atmosphere left a trail of fire that burned with unnatural colors. The World Eaters. Primarch's transformation was complete and terrible to behold, his form now more demon than transhuman. Where his feet touched Terran soil, the very ground began to bleed with sympathetic response to the rage that consumed his essence. Mortarion materialized through clouds of toxic gas that killed everything they touched, his scythe trailing vapors that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The Death Guard, Primarch's sepulchral voice, echoed across the battlefield with harmonics that resonated in the bones of all who heard them. Fulgrim arrived like a nightmare wrapped in perfect beauty, his form shifting between configurations that hurt to perceive directly. The Emperor's children followed in his wake, their movements flowing with grace that transcended merely physical limitations. Against this tide of supernatural horror, the Loyalist forces stood firm with courage that transcended mortal understanding. Sanguinius led aerial assaults against demon engines, whose very presence poisoned the air around them, his sword carving through entities that had been spawned in realms where physics held no meaning. The Emperor himself took the field for the first time since the Unification Wars, his presence transforming the nature of combat entirely. Where he walked, demons simply ceased to exist, their essence burned away by proximity to power that could reshape reality through will alone. Yet even his might had limits when faced with enemies who commanded the resources of entire dimensions, dedicated to destruction and despair. The battle raged across Terra's surface with intensity that threatened to crack the planet's crust beneath the weight of energies that should never have been unleashed in material reality. The Imperial Palace's outer walls, which had stood inviolate since the earliest days of human civilization, began to crack under the assault of weapons that fired ammunition composed of crystallized malice and hatred. Demon Primarchs rampaged through the inner courtyards where the Emperor's most loyal servants had walked in peace for generations. Their presence corrupted everything they touched, transforming gardens that had bloomed for millennia into twisted mockeries of life that screamed with voices that had never known human warmth. The final confrontation approached as Horus himself descended from his flagship to walk the soil of humanity's birthworld. The War Master, who might have been, led his forces toward the throne room, where his father waited, with the patience of one whose plans encompassed centuries yet to come. Around them, Terra burned with fires that would take generations to extinguish, its sacred soil stained with blood that could never be washed clean. The fate of human civilization hung in the balance as brother prepared to face brother in a contest that would determine whether the species that had dared to claim dominion over the stars would survive its own ambitions. In the depths of space above the battlefield, ancient powers that fed upon the pain of mortals watched with satisfaction that exceeded their most optimistic projections. The galaxy burned with the fires of civil war, and from those flames would emerge either salvation or damnation for all who called themselves human. The Angel of Death spread his wings above a world transformed into hell itself, preparing for the sacrifice that prophecy had declared inevitable since the moment of his creation. Whether that sacrifice would prove sufficient to save what remained of humanity's future was a question that only blood and time could answer. The siege of Terra had begun, and its outcome would echo across eternity like thunder in the void. Chapter 9. Blood and Gold. The vengeful spirit hung in Terra's orbit like a cancerous star, whose light brought only corruption and despair, its hull writhing with modifications that violated every principle of sacred geometry. From the flagship's command bridge, Horus Lupercal gazed down upon the world of his birth with eyes that blazed with power, drawn from realms where sanity held no meaning. The Primarch, who had once been the Emperor's most favored son, now bore marks of transformation that spoke of bargains purchased with the sacrifice of everything he had once held sacred. Below, on Terra's ravaged surface, the imperial palace burned with fires that cast shadows in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Yet for all the devastation that his forces had wrought upon humanity's birthworld, Horus felt no satisfaction in the spectacle of destruction. The true prize lay not in the conquest of territory, but in the corruption of souls that had remained stubbornly pure despite decades of careful manipulation. The teleportarium chamber aboard the Red Tear hummed with energies that made reality itself tremble at their edges, its ancient mechanisms prepared to transport flesh across the void in defiance of the laws that governed material existence. Sanguinius stood at the center of the ritual circle, his perfect features illuminated by the pale glow of translation matrices whose operation required the sacrifice of principles that had once seemed absolute. Around him, the most veteran warriors of the Blood Angels maintained formation with the discipline that had marked their legion since its earliest days. Yet none could entirely suppress the knowledge that they were about to attempt something that challenged the boundaries between heroism and madness itself. They would board the flagship of their fallen brother, walk corridors that had been twisted by powers beyond human comprehension, and face enemies whose very existence violated natural law. Captain Ascalon stepped forward, his scarred features bearing the weight of loyalty that transcended rational calculation. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the energies that crackled through the chamber's atmosphere. "The Legion stands ready to follow you into whatever hell awaits aboard that cursed vessel." Sanguinius regarded his most trusted officer with eyes that held depths of affection and regret in equal measure. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of one who understood the true cost of the choices that lay before them. "No," he said quietly, each word falling like a funeral bell tolled for the dead. "This burden is mine alone to bear. What waits aboard the vengeful spirit was my brother long before he became the enemy of everything we hold sacred. The blood that must be spilled to end this madness flows in both our veins." The Angel of Death activated the teleportarium with movements that carried the grace of absolute finality, his form dissolving into cascades of light that carried him across the void toward a confrontation that prophecy had declared inevitable since the moment of his creation. Around him, the familiar weight of his armor and the blessed steel of his sword provided comfort that transcended merely physical reassurance. The materialization chamber aboard the Vengeful Spirit bore no resemblance to the clean geometric lines that had marked imperial construction during the golden age of the Great Crusade. Its walls writhed with organic growths that pulsed with rhythms that echoed heartbeats from alien dimensions, while the very air itself carried the stench of corruption that made breathing an act of conscious will. Sanguinius emerged from the translation effect with sword already drawn, his enhanced senses recoiling from atmospheric conditions that existed partially in realms where thought became reality and will reshaped the fundamental constants of existence. Around him, the corridors of what had once been a loyal imperial vessel now stretched into configurations that violated every principle of conventional architecture. The path to the command bridge led through chambers where the deck plating had been replaced by substances that screamed when stepped upon, past viewports that showed not the familiar stars of Terra's system, but glimpses of dimensions where darkness held dominion over light itself. With each step, Sanguinius felt the weight of prophetic visions pressing against his consciousness like floodwaters held back by a crumbling dam. In those glimpses of possible futures, he saw himself falling beneath his brother's corrupted blade, his perfect features twisted by the kind of rage that could shatter worlds. He saw the black rage spreading through his legion like wildfire through dry timber, transforming noble warriors into berserkers whose only purpose was the spilling of blood. He saw terror consumed by fires that would burn for millennia, its sacred soil transformed into a monument to the price of failure. Yet he also saw other possibilities, paths forward that led through sacrifice toward something that might one day be called redemption. The Angel of Death had always known that his greatest contribution to humanity's future would be measured not in victories won, but in the manner of his dying. The command bridge of the vengeful spirit had been transformed into a temple dedicated to powers that hungered for the destruction of everything the Imperium represented. Where once tactical displays had shown the disposition of loyal forces, now altars built from human bone-supported icons that hurt to perceive directly. The very air itself carried whispers in languages that had been spoken before the birth of stars. Horus stood at the center of this transformed space, his form radiating authority that transcended the merely physical and entered realms where will alone could reshape reality itself. The War Master, who might have been, now bore marks of corruption that spoke of bargains struck with entities whose existence predated human civilization by eons beyond counting. When he turned to face his approaching brother, his pale features bore an expression that combined genuine affection with malevolence so pure that looking upon it directly caused physical pain. "Sanguinius," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond mortal understanding. "The Angel of Death comes at last to embrace his destiny." Sanguinius raised his sword, its edge blazing with light that made the demon-spawned shadows recoil despite their supernatural nature. "Not death, brother. Duty. The path you have chosen leads only to damnation for both our species and yours." Horus laughed, the sound carrying echoes of entities whose amusement fed upon the suffering of mortals. "Duty to what? To a father who abandoned us to pursue projects that served his own mysterious purposes? To an Imperium built upon lies so fundamental that even he dares not speak them aloud?" The accusation struck at doubts that had haunted Sanguinius since the earliest days of his elevation to the rank of War Master. Questions about the Emperor's true nature and the ultimate purpose of the Great Crusade that had never received satisfactory answers. Yet beneath those doubts lay something stronger, the absolute conviction that some truths were worth dying to preserve. "Duty to humanity," Sanguinius replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of absolute faith. "To the billions of souls who look to us for protection, not corruption. To the children yet unborn who deserve the chance to inherit something better than eternal war." The philosophical chasm that had opened between them at Ulanor now yawned wide enough to swallow galaxies, each brother representing principles that could not coexist within the same universe. Around them, reality itself seemed to strain under the weight of conflicting visions of what human civilization should become. Horus raised his own weapon, the demon blade Worldbreaker blazing with energies that had been forged in the deepest furnaces of the warp itself. "Then let us settle this as warriors," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of one who commanded not merely mortal armies, but the attention of gods. Brother against brother, as it was always meant to be. The duel that followed would be remembered in the chronicles of both sides as the moment when nobility confronted corruption in its purest form, when the choice between salvation and damnation was decided by the skill of blade and the strength of will, rather than the maneuvering of fleets or the deployment of armies. Sanguinius fought with the fury of an angel whose patience had finally reached its limits, his sword carving through reality itself to strike at the essence of corruption that had claimed his beloved brother. Each stroke blazed with light that burned away shadows older than human memory, every parry turning aside attacks that carried the weight of malevolent dimensions. Yet Horus had been transformed by powers that transcended physical limitation, his strength now drawing upon reservoirs that existed beyond the boundaries of material reality. Worldbreaker struck with force sufficient to crack continents, its edge trailing energies that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The command bridge shook under the impact of their conflict, its demon-spawned architecture writhing in sympathetic response to the clash of wills that threatened to tear apart the fabric of space itself. Around them, the very air burned with discharged energies, as each blow exchanged carried power sufficient to level cities. "You cannot win," Horus declared, as their blades locked in a contest of pure strength, his corrupted features twisted into an expression of savage satisfaction. "The gods themselves flow through my veins. What can mortal nobility offer against divine power?" Sanguinius felt the weight of prophetic visions crystallizing into absolute certainty as he recognized the moment that destiny had been building toward since his first breath. In the space between heartbeats, he saw the path forward with clarity that transcended merely human understanding. "Not victory," he replied, his voice carrying the calm acceptance of ultimate sacrifice. "Redemption." The angel of death released his grip upon his sword, allowing Worldbreaker's corrupted edge to pierce his perfect form with a blow that should have ended any mortal existence. Yet even as demon-forged steel tasted his blood, Sanguinius struck with power that transcended the merely physical. His bare hands closed around the hilt of his brother's weapon, his touch blazing with light that burned away the corruption that had claimed one of the galaxy's greatest heroes. For one impossible moment, clarity returned to Horus's pale features as the madness that had driven him for years beyond counting was stripped away by proximity to sacrifice that sought not victory, but understanding. "Brother," Horus whispered, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that came too late to change anything, but perhaps late enough to matter. "What have I done?" The question received no answer because none existed that could encompass the scope of betrayal that had stained the galaxy red with innocent blood. Yet in that moment of clarity, something passed between the brothers that transcended words. Forgiveness offered freely despite crimes that could never be forgiven. Love that endured despite wounds that could never heal. Sanguinius felt his strength ebbing as demon poison coursed through his enhanced physiology, yet his sacrifice had accomplished its purpose. The blow that Worldbreaker had delivered carried corruption that would have slain any mortal warrior instantly. Yet it had also created an opening that destiny had decreed must be seized. The command bridge doors exploded inward with force that made the vessel's superstructure groan in protest, admitting a presence that transformed the nature of reality itself through proximity alone. The Emperor of mankind strode into the chamber with movements that sent shockwaves through dimensions that existed beyond mortal perception, his golden armor blazing with power that could reshape the fundamental constants of existence. When his gaze fell upon the tableau before him, one son dying in the arms of another whose sanity had returned too late to matter, His perfect features reflected depths of sorrow that encompassed the weight of failure that no amount of divine authority could entirely ease. "My sons," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the energies that crackled through the chamber's demon-spawned atmosphere. "The time for choice has passed. Only consequence remains." What followed was not battle, but the systematic application of power so absolute that it transcended the boundaries between justice and mercy, punishment and redemption. The Emperor's will struck Horus with force that unraveled the very essence of his corrupted existence. Yet even that cosmic authority was tempered by grief for the loss of one who had once been loved beyond measure. Worldbreaker shattered into fragments that screamed as they dissolved back into the warp stuff from which they had been forged. The demon-spawned modifications that had twisted the vengeful spirit's architecture began to collapse as the power that sustained them was stripped away by proximity to one whose authority transcended the gods of chaos themselves. In his final moments, Horus looked upon his father with eyes that held depths of regret beyond measure. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling of dimensional barriers being re-established. "I chose poorly." The Emperor knelt beside his dying sons, his gauntleted hands gentle, despite the power that could crack worlds flowing through his enhanced form. "Forgiveness is not mine to grant," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "It flows freely from one whose sacrifice makes such grace possible." Sanguinius felt the final darkness closing around him as his enhanced physiology finally succumbed to wounds that no amount of transhuman engineering could survive. Yet in that moment of transition, he felt not defeat, but completion, the fulfillment of purpose that had guided him since his first days as a weapon designed to preserve rather than destroy. With the destruction of Horus, the traitor assault upon Terra collapsed like a structure whose foundation stones had been suddenly removed. Across the system, demon engines began to dissolve back into the warp stuff from which they had been conjured. Corrupted vessels found their modified hulls reverting to configurations that could no longer support life in material reality. The civil war that had threatened to tear apart the galaxy itself ended not with the thunder of orbital bombardment or the clash of Titan legions, but with the quiet death of an angel whose greatest victory had been measured not in enemies slain, but in brothers redeemed. On Terra's surface, the Imperial Palace still burned with fires that would take generations to extinguish, yet those flames now carried the promise of renewal rather than destruction. The Great Crusade was ended, yet from its ashes would emerge something that might one day prove worthy of the price that had been paid to preserve it. In the depths of space around them, ancient powers that had fed upon discord and division found their plans shattered by sacrifice that they had never comprehended. The galaxy would heal from the wounds of civil war, and humanity would continue its long journey toward whatever destiny awaited among the stars. The angel of death had spread his wings above a world transformed by war, and in his dying had ensured that the future would belong not to the darkness, but to those who chose to kindle lights against it. His sacrifice was complete, and in that completion lay the seeds of everything that would follow. Chapter 10. The Price of Victory. The Golden Throne. Chamber bore the weight of silence that had settled like dust across the heart of the Imperial Palace, its vast spaces echoing with the absence of voices that would never again counsel the master of mankind. In the wake of victory that had preserved human civilization at costs too terrible for comfortable contemplation, the Emperor of mankind sat upon his ancient seat of authority, with features that reflected depths of grief beyond mortal understanding. Before him, arranged with the reverence due to fallen heroes, lay the body of Sanguinius, primarch of the Blood Angels, and the War Master who had died to preserve everything his father had sought to build across the galaxy. The Angel of Death's perfect features bore the peaceful expression of one who had found completion in sacrifice, yet the wounds that marked his transhuman form told stories of agony that no amount of posthumous serenity could entirely erase. The Emperor's golden eyes, which had gazed upon the birth and death of civilizations across millennia beyond counting, now focused upon the still form of his most noble son with intensity that seemed to burn through flesh and bone to touch the essence beneath. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of loss that even divine authority could not entirely ease. "2 sons lost," he said, each word falling like drops of molten metal upon the chamber's marble floors. One to corruption that consumed everything worthy within him, another to sacrifice that preserved everything noble he represented. Yet even victory tastes of ashes when purchased with such blood. From the shadows at the edges of the throne chamber, figures emerged who had gathered to witness the accounting of costs that victory had demanded. Robot Guilliman approached with the measured pace that had marked all his interactions with his father, his analytical features bearing the strain of one whose careful calculations had been shattered by variables that no strategic doctrine could have predicted. "Father," Guilliman said, offering the precisely calculated bow that acknowledged imperial authority while maintaining the dignity due to a surviving son. "The immediate crisis has passed, yet the work of reconstruction demands attention that transcends personal grief. The Imperium requires guidance if it is to emerge from this conflict stronger than before." The Emperor regarded his surviving son with gaze that encompassed futures yet unwritten, possibilities that stretched across centuries yet to come, like branching paths through an infinite garden. When he finally nodded, the gesture carried the weight of decisions that would reshape the very foundations of human civilization. "You speak wisely, my son. The Great Crusade as we knew it has ended, consumed by fires that we ourselves kindled through choices that seemed necessary at the time. What emerges from these ashes must be built upon foundations strong enough to prevent such catastrophe from recurring." Lionel Johnson materialized from the throne chamber's entrance, his stern features bearing the marks of one who had witnessed horrors that would haunt the dreams of lesser warriors for generations yet to come. The Dark Angel's Primarch's approach carried the weight of intelligence that brought no comfort to those who heard it. "The traitor forces collapse without their leader's unifying presence," he reported, his voice carrying across the chamber with characteristic precision. "Magnus confirms that the warp storms dissipate as demon engines dissolve back into the stuff from which they were conjured. Yet scattered elements of corrupted legions remain at large throughout the galaxy." The implications of that intelligence struck those assembled like physical blows, each word carrying reminder that victory over Horus had not eliminated every threat that the Civil War had spawned. Across the vast reaches of the galaxy, remnants of traitor forces now existed as cancers within the body of the Imperium, their corruption potentially spreading to infect worlds that had never known the touch of chaos. "They must be hunted down," the Emperor declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Every corrupted warrior, every demon engine, every artifact tainted by the powers we have opposed. The galaxy must be cleansed of their influence before it can spread further." From deeper within the throne chamber came the sound of armored footsteps that carried rhythms of grief too profound for mere mortal understanding. Captain Azkaelan of the Blood Angels approached with movements that spoke of a soul shattered by losses that no amount of transhuman conditioning could prepare any warrior to endure. The sanguinary guard officer's scarred features bore the marks of one whose purpose had been defined by service to a master now beyond the reach of mortal duty. When he knelt before the golden throne, his voice carried the hollow quality of one whose world had been reduced to ashes in the space between heartbeats. "My Emperor," Azkaelon said, his words barely audible above the chamber's oppressive silence. "The Blood Angels await your commands, yet we are no longer what we once were. The rage spreads through our ranks like wildfire through dry timber. Nearly half the Legion has succumbed to visions of our father's death." The Emperor leaned forward upon his throne, his perfect features reflecting concern that transcended the merely tactical and entered realms where paternal affection warred with imperial necessity. The Black Rage had always been the curse that haunted the sons of Sanguinius, yet now that genetic flaw had been triggered on a scale that threatened to transform noble warriors into berserkers whose only purpose was the spilling of blood. "The burden your legion bears is heavy beyond measure," the Emperor acknowledged, his voice carrying genuine compassion despite the weight of larger concerns that pressed upon his attention. Yet in that burden lies also the seed of purpose that may yet preserve what is worthy within your ranks. Around the throne chamber, the assembled Primarchs contemplated the implications of a legion consumed by genetic madness, their enhanced minds calculating the tactical and political ramifications of forces that could no longer be relied upon to follow conventional military doctrine. Gilliman stepped forward, his analytical nature already working to find solutions within the parameters of seemingly impossible problems. "The Codex Astartes," he said, his voice carrying the weight of inspiration striking like lightning across storm-darkened skies. "The organizational principles we have discussed could provide structure that channels their fury toward worthy targets, while preventing the kind of unified corruption that claimed our fallen brothers." The Emperor nodded slowly, his golden gaze fixed upon futures that stretched across millennia yet to come. "The divisions you propose have merit beyond immediate tactical considerations. Smaller formations, bound by oaths that transcend legion loyalty, guided by principles that prevent any single leader from accumulating the kind of authority that enables galaxy-spanning corruption." The conversation that followed would reshape the very foundations upon which the Imperium's military might was built, transforming the massive legions that had conquered the galaxy into smaller chapters, whose loyalty was divided between their own traditions and service to the larger imperial cause. As the Primarchs discussed the technical details of reorganization and reconstruction, other currents flowed through the palace's corridors that spoke of grief too profound for official acknowledgement. In the Blood Angels' quarters, warriors who had served alongside their father for centuries found themselves struggling with visions that painted every wall with images of his death. Brother Mephiston knelt in the chapter's chapel, his enhanced features twisted by the effort of maintaining sanity against genetic programming that demanded nothing but vengeance for wounds that could never be healed. Around him, his battle brothers maintained their vigil with discipline that spoke of loyalty, transcending the madness that threatened to consume their souls. "He gave everything," Mephiston whispered, his voice carrying clearly despite the tremors that shook his enhanced frame. "Our Father, our Lord, our Angel. He gave everything so that we might endure. We must not let his sacrifice become meaningless through surrender to the darkness that calls to us." The words carried weight that resonated through dimensions beyond the merely physical, offering anchor points for minds that struggled against currents of rage that threatened to sweep away everything they had once held sacred. Meanwhile, in the palace's memorial halls, representatives from 1,000 worlds had begun to gather for ceremonies that would honor the War Master, whose sacrifice had preserved human civilization itself. Each delegation bore offerings that spoke of gratitude too profound for mere words, banners woven from threads of gold and silver, weapons forged by master craftsmen whose skills had been perfected across centuries of dedicated labor, art objects whose beauty captured glimpses of the nobility that Sanguinius had embodied throughout his service. Remembrancer Mercedes Ollerton stood before a statue carved from Baylite marble, her enhanced memory recording every detail of features that had been rendered with skill that transcended merely mortal artistry. When she spoke, her voice carried across the memorial hall with clarity that preserved each word for posterity. Here lies Sanguinius, called the Angel of Death, Primarch of the Blood Angels Legion, War Master of the Great Crusade, and Savior of humanity's future. His wings bore him not to glory, but to sacrifice. His sword blazed not for conquest, but for preservation. In his dying he achieved what his living could not, the redemption of one who had fallen, and the preservation of all who remained pure. The eulogy continued with words that would be carved into monuments across 1,000 worlds, each phrase carefully chosen to capture some fragment of the nobility that had defined the Angel of Death throughout his service to humanity's cause. Yet even as ceremonies of remembrance began throughout the imperial domains, darker currents stirred in the spaces between the stars, where the influence of chaos remained strong despite their champion's defeat. The traitor legions had been broken, their unity shattered by the loss of the figure who had bound them together through shared corruption. Yet fragments remained that carried seeds of future corruption. In the eye of terror, where reality bent before the will of powers that hungered for mortal suffering, the surviving champions of the fallen legions gathered around altars built from the bones of innocence. Their bitter laughter echoed through dimensions that existed beyond human understanding as they contemplated the irony of their situation. They had lost their war for the galaxy's body, yet the wounds they had inflicted upon its soul would fester for millennia yet to come. The black rage would spread through the sons of Sanguinius like a genetic poison, transforming noble warriors into living monuments to their father's sacrifice. The Imperium would reorganize itself around principles of division and suspicion, trading the unity that had made the Great Crusade possible for security that might prevent future corruption. Victory had been achieved, yet its price had been measured in the destruction of everything that had made that victory worth achieving in the first place. The Emperor understood this bitter mathematics as he sat upon his golden throne, his enhanced perception encompassing the full scope of what had been lost and what had been preserved. When he finally rose from his seat of authority, the movement sent shockwaves through dimensions that existed beyond mortal comprehension. "The future begins now," he declared, his voice carrying across the chamber with the authority of one whose will could reshape the fundamental constants of reality. "We will build upon the foundations that sacrifice has provided, create institutions strong enough to endure the tests that await. The Great Crusade is ended, yet the great work continues." Around him, the surviving Primarchs bowed in acknowledgement of imperial will, each carrying away assignments that would determine the shape of human civilization for centuries yet to come. Guilliman would craft the organizational principles that would govern military might. Dawn would oversee the reconstruction of defenses that could hold against any future assault. The Lion would hunt down the scattered remnants of corruption that threatened to spread their poison throughout the galaxy. Yet all their efforts would be measured against the standard set by one who was no longer present to witness their fruits, whose sacrifice had created the very possibility of success while ensuring that he would never see its achievement. In the depths of space around Terra, where the debris of shattered fleets drifted like monuments to the cost of civil war, ancient powers that had fed upon discord and division found their plans fundamentally disrupted by outcomes they had never anticipated. The galaxy would heal from the wounds of fraternal conflict, yet the scars that remained would serve as permanent reminders of the prices that freedom demanded and the vigilance that preservation required. The Angel of Death had spread his wings above a world transformed by war, and in his dying had ensured that the future would belong to those who chose to kindle lights against the encroaching darkness. His sacrifice was complete, and from its ashes would emerge an Imperium strong enough to endure the trials that awaited among the stars. Chapter 11. Shadows of What Could Have Been. The Imperial Palace stood beneath skies that had been cleansed of the blood-red taint that had marked Terra's heavens during the dark months of civil war. Yet those who walked its rebuilt corridors could sense that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between ruler and ruled. Where once the Emperor's authority had flowed from divine mandate wrapped in secular philosophy, now it carried the weight of sacrifice that had been witnessed by billions of souls across the galaxy. In the highest tower of the Astronomicon complex, the Emperor of Mankind stood before windows that offered views across the sprawling cityscape of the throne world, his golden features reflecting depths of contemplation that encompassed futures that stretched across millennia yet to come. The master of humanity's enhanced perception encompassed not merely what had occurred, but what might have been had different choices been made at critical junctions in the timeline that had led to this moment. The alternative path was easy enough to envision. Horus elevated to War Master as originally intended, his pride and ambition carefully nurtured by influences that fed upon wounded vanity and frustrated desire for recognition. The corruption would have spread more slowly perhaps, but with greater subtlety and deeper penetration into the very foundations of imperial structure. The civil war that followed would have been longer, more devastating, and ultimately less conclusive in its outcome. "Father," came a voice from the shadows at the edge of the chamber, carrying tones that had been rendered deeper and more resonant by modifications that spoke of recent augmentation. Magnus the Red stepped into the pale light cast by Terra's rebuilt sun, his towering form bearing marks of transformation that had been necessitated by his new role as guardian of humanity's most crucial project. The Crimson King's single eye blazed with psychic fires that had been carefully channeled and focused through technologies that merged the ancient wisdom of the Aeldari with the innovative genius of human engineering. Where once his sorceress abilities had been viewed with suspicion by imperial doctrine, now they served as the cornerstone of defenses that protected the webway from incursions that would have doomed the entire project to catastrophic failure. "The repairs proceed ahead of schedule," Magnus reported, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the merely physical. "The breach points have been sealed with ward structures that should hold against anything the warp can manifest. The human sections of the webway network will be ready for testing within the solar year." The Emperor nodded slowly, his golden gaze reflecting satisfaction that transcended mere technical achievement and entered realms where the preservation of human potential was measured against cosmic timescales. The Webway project represented not merely an alternative to warp travel, but the promise of liberation from humanity's dependence upon the chaotic currents that fed the very entities they had spent so much blood opposing. "Your brother's sacrifice made this possible," the Emperor observed, his words carrying weight that encompassed more than immediate tactical considerations. Sanguinius understood that some prices must be paid if anything of lasting value is to be preserved. His death broke the corruption that would have spread like cancer through every institution we had built. Magnus contemplated this observation with the analytical detachment that marked his approach to all problems, his enhanced mind calculating implications that stretched far beyond the immediate scope of reconstruction and repair. Yet the galaxy he died to save is not the same one that the Great Crusade sought to unite. The compassionate approach he advocated has taken root in ways that would have seemed impossible under the original design. The truth of that assessment was evident throughout the Imperial domains, where the aftermath of civil war had been met not with the brutal efficiency that had marked earlier compliance actions, but with measured responses that prioritized preservation over punishment. Worlds that had been touched by corruption were cleansed through careful purification rather than orbital bombardment. Populations that had been exposed to chaos influence received treatment and rehabilitation rather than summary execution. The change in imperial methodology could be traced directly to principles that Sanguinius had championed during his brief tenure as War Master, ideals that had survived his death to reshape the very foundations of how the Imperium related to the human populations it governed. Where once compliance had been measured in terms of speed and efficiency, now it was calculated according to metrics that included the preservation of local cultures and the integration of existing power structures into the larger imperial framework. The reports from Cadia are illuminating, Magnus continued, producing a data slate whose contents represented intelligence gathered from across the galaxy by agents whose loyalty had been proven in the fires of recent conflict. The negotiations that failed so spectacularly under the previous approach have been renewed under protocols that emphasize patience over expediency. The local nobility now requests formal integration into imperial structure rather than resisting it. The Emperor received this news with the kind of satisfaction that came not from vindication, but from the recognition that wisdom could emerge from tragedy if those who survived were willing to learn from the mistakes of the past. The Cadian situation had served as the catalyst for the philosophical differences that had ultimately led to civil war, yet now those same differences were being resolved through the kind of patient diplomacy that Sanguinius had advocated. The angel's approach bore fruit that he never lived to harvest, the Emperor observed, his voice carrying genuine regret for losses that could not be undone. Yet perhaps it is fitting that his legacy should be measured not in worlds conquered, but in souls preserved. From the depths of the tower's lower chambers came the sound of armored footsteps that carried rhythms of purpose tempered by grief that would never entirely fade. Robert Guillemin emerged from the transport shaft with movements that spoke of one whose administrative genius had been tested by challenges that transcended conventional understanding of governmental management. The Ultramarines Primarch bore data slates whose contents represented the first comprehensive assessment of how the Civil War's aftermath was being processed throughout the imperial domains. His analytical features reflected the strain of one whose careful calculations had been forced to accommodate variables that existed beyond the reach of rational prediction. The Codex Astartes has been implemented across 80% of the loyal legions, Guillemin reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of one whose organizational principles had proven their worth under the most demanding circumstances. The chapter system provides the kind of distributed authority that prevents the concentration of power that enabled the corruption we opposed. Yet even as he spoke of successful implementation, Guillemin's features bore the weight of knowledge that administrative excellence could not entirely erase the scars that recent conflicts had left upon the imperial psyche. The division of the great legions into smaller chapters represented not merely tactical reorganization, but the acknowledgement that unity itself could become a vulnerability when corrupted by influences that fed upon ambition and wounded pride. The Blood Angels present unique challenges, Guilliman continued, his voice carrying careful neutrality as he addressed the most painful legacy of recent events. The Black Rage spreads through their ranks with each passing month. Nearly 70% of the Legion now requires specialized containment protocols during combat operations. The Emperor's perfect features reflected depths of sorrow that encompassed the weight of watching noble warriors consumed by genetic programming that transformed heroism into madness. The sons of Sanguinius had become living monuments to their father's sacrifice, their affliction serving as permanent reminder of the costs that preservation demanded and the prices that duty required. Yet they endure, the Emperor said quietly, his words carrying across the chamber, despite their soft tone. They bear their burden with the same nobility that marked their father's service. In their suffering, they preserve something of his essence that mere memory could not maintain. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another figure, whose presence carried news from the distant reaches of the galaxy, where the aftermath of civil war continued to unfold in ways that challenged every prediction. Lionel Johnson materialized in the chamber's entrance, his stern features bearing intelligence that spoke of campaigns fought in shadows, where conventional military doctrine held little meaning. The traitor remnants have been driven beyond the galactic rim, the Dark Angel's Primarch reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of one whose hunt had finally achieved its primary objectives. The last confirmed sighting places them in the region that Imperial cartographers designate as the Eye of Terror, where warp storms make pursuit inadvisable. The implications of that intelligence struck those assembled like physical blows, each word carrying reminder that victory had been purchased rather than eliminated the threats that had necessitated such sacrifice in the first place. Beyond the galaxy's edge, in realms where reality bent before the will of entities that hungered for mortal suffering, the scattered remnants of corruption would fester and grow until they were strong enough to attempt another assault upon human civilization. They will return, the Emperor observed, with the certainty of one whose enhanced perception encompassed timelines that stretched far beyond mortal understanding. Perhaps not in our lifetime, perhaps not in the lifetime of our immediate successors, but they will return. The prices we have paid have purchased time, not permanent victory. The weight of that prophecy settled over the assembled Primarchs like a shroud drawn across hope itself, each word carrying implications that challenged the very foundations of what they thought their sacrifices had achieved. Yet within that darkness lay also the seeds of purpose that would guide human civilization through the trials yet to come. Then we use that time wisely, Guilliman declared, his analytical mind already calculating the preparations that would be necessary to meet future threats. We build institutions strong enough to endure. We create redundancies that prevent single points of failure. We ensure that the next time such corruption manifests, it faces an Imperium prepared for the worst it can offer. Magnus raised his single eye toward the chamber's vaulted ceiling, his psychic perception reaching out across the galaxy to touch upon currents of possibility that flowed like tides through the warp itself. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated with knowledge drawn from realms beyond mortal understanding. The future remains unwritten, he observed, his words carrying the weight of prophecy tempered by hope. Yet the choices we make in the coming years will determine whether humanity's destiny lies in the light of achieved potential or the darkness of squandered opportunity. The Emperor rose from his contemplative position before the windows, his movements sending subtle shockwaves through dimensions that existed beyond conventional perception. When he turned to face his surviving sons, his golden features bore the expression of one whose plans encompassed centuries yet to come. "The Great Crusade is ended," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Yet the great work continues. We will build upon the foundations that sacrifice has provided, create institutions worthy of the blood that has been spilled to preserve them." Around him, the surviving Primarchs bowed in acknowledgement of imperial will, each carrying away assignments that would shape the development of human civilization for millennia yet to come. The Imperium that emerged from the ashes of civil war would be different from what had come before. More cautious, perhaps, but also more resilient. More divided in structure, but more unified in purpose. The path that Sanguinius had advocated during his brief tenure as War Master had survived his death to become the guiding principle for reconstruction and renewal. Compassion tempered with strength, mercy balanced against necessity, the preservation of what was worthy taking precedence over the simple accumulation of power. In the depths of space beyond the galaxy's edge, where ancient powers nursed grudges that had festered since the birth of stars themselves, the scattered remnants of corruption watched and waited for their chance to return. They had learned valuable lessons from their defeat, that direct assault might fail where subtle infiltration could succeed, that patience could achieve what impatience had denied them. Yet they also faced an Imperium that had been tempered by trial and strengthened by sacrifice. The humanity that would greet their eventual return would be different from the one they had fought. More suspicious of corruption, more vigilant against the kind of philosophical divisions that had enabled their initial success, more willing to pay whatever prices preservation demanded. The galaxy turned beneath stars whose light carried the promise of futures yet unwritten, possibilities that stretched across cosmic timescales like branching paths through an infinite garden. The choices made in the aftermath of civil war would echo across those futures, determining whether the species that had dared to claim dominion over the stars would prove worthy of the sacrifices that had preserved their potential. The Angel of Death had spread his wings above a civilization transformed by war, and in his dying had ensured that the path forward would be illuminated not by the harsh light of conquest, but by the gentler radiance of hope tempered with wisdom. His sacrifice had purchased time, and in that time lay all the difference between salvation and damnation for the countless souls who called the galaxy home. Chapter 12. The Dream That Endures. The Golden Throne chamber stood in silence that had deepened with the passing years, its vast spaces filled with the weight of choices that would echo across millennia, yet unwritten. The Emperor of mankind sat upon his ancient seat of authority, his golden features illuminated by the pale glow of cogitator displays that showed the progress of reconstruction across a galaxy still bearing the scars of fraternal war. Yet for all the data that flowed through the chamber's information networks, his attention remained fixed upon questions that no amount of empirical analysis could resolve. The throne room's walls bore new additions that had not been present during the Great Crusade's golden age. Memorial plaques carved from materials gathered from every world that imperial forces had brought into compliance, each one bearing names of those who had fallen in service to humanity's expansion among the stars. At the center of this pantheon of sacrifice, rendered in belite marble that caught and held light like captured starfire, stood the likeness of Sanguinius, wings spread in eternal protection over the throne world he had died to preserve. Before this memorial, figures knelt in vigil that had continued without interruption since the day the Angel of Death had been laid to rest in the crypts beneath the imperial palace. Blood angels in crimson armor maintained their watch with discipline that spoke of devotion, transcending the boundaries between duty and worship, their enhanced forms motionless as statues, yet radiating the kind of barely controlled violence that marked warriors forever changed by prophetic visions of their father's sacrifice. Brother Mephiston rose from his position of reverence, his scarred features bearing the marks of one whose sanity had been tested by genetic programming that transformed grief into rage with the regularity of tidal forces. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the chamber, despite its soft tone. "He endures in us," Mephiston said, his words directed toward the marble likeness, yet carrying implications that encompassed far more than mere remembrance. Every time the rage threatens to consume our reason, we see his face in the moment of sacrifice. Every time we face enemies that would corrupt what we protect, we hear his voice counseling mercy tempered with strength. The observation struck at the heart of questions that had haunted imperial philosophers since the aftermath of civil war, had created space for contemplation that the Great Crusade's relentless pace had never permitted. The Blood Angels had become living monuments to their Primarch's legacy, their genetic curse transformed into a form of veneration that preserved something essential about the principles he had embodied. From the shadows at the edge of the throne chamber, other figures emerged who had come to bear witness to anniversary observances that marked another year in the slow process of galactic healing. Robert Guilliman approached with data slates bearing comprehensive assessments of Imperial reconstruction, his analytical features reflecting satisfaction, tempered by awareness of how much work remained undone. "The compliance rates continue to improve," Guilliman reported, his voice carrying the weight of one whose organizational genius had been tested by challenges that transcended conventional administrative doctrine. Worlds that once required decades of pacification now request integration into imperial structure voluntarily. The compassionate approach yields results that brute force could never have achieved. The Emperor nodded slowly, his golden gaze encompassing tactical displays that showed the spread of human civilization across stellar distances that dwarfed the imagination of those who had never gazed upon the galaxy from his perspective. Each green icon representing successful integration carried the weight of billions of souls who had chosen acceptance over resistance, cooperation over conflict. Yet even success carried its own burdens, its own questions about whether mercy was wisdom or weakness when applied to a galaxy that respected only strength. The compassionate policies that Sanguinius had advocated during his brief tenure as War Master had taken root throughout imperial governance. Yet they had also created vulnerabilities that enemies would undoubtedly seek to exploit when the opportunity arose. "The Cadian integration proceeds beyond all projections," Guilliman continued, consulting displays that showed population statistics and industrial output from worlds that had once stood as symbols of diplomatic failure. Their local nobility has embraced imperial culture while maintaining traditions that enrich rather than threaten the larger framework. Their military forces request assignment to frontier sectors where their expertise can serve the greater good. The success story that Cadia represented had been replicated across hundreds of worlds, where patient negotiation had replaced orbital bombardment as the preferred method of bringing human populations into compliance with imperial law. Yet each such success raised questions about whether the resources devoted to such approaches might have been better spent on more direct forms of expansion and conquest. Magnus the Red materialized in the chamber, with the subtle displacement of air that marked his mastery of dimensional manipulation. His towering form bearing intelligence, gathered from realms that existed beyond the reach of conventional reconnaissance. The Crimson King's single eye blazed with psychic fires that had been focused through years of disciplined service as guardian of humanity's most crucial project. "The webway network approaches operational capacity," Magnus reported, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with knowledge drawn from sources that predated human civilization by eons beyond counting. "The first test runs through the rebuilt sections have exceeded all safety parameters. Humanity stands on the threshold of liberation from dependence upon warp travel." The implications of that achievement struck those assembled with the weight of transformation that would reshape the very foundations of galactic civilization. Freedom from the chaotic currents of the warp meant freedom from the entities that dwelt within its depths, liberation from the constant threat of corruption that had claimed so many noble souls during the recent conflict. Yet even this triumph carried its own shadows, its own questions about whether the prices paid to achieve it had been necessary or merely the result of choices that could have been made differently. The Emperor's enhanced perception encompassed timelines that branched like infinite trees through probability space, each path representing decisions that might have led to different outcomes. In one such alternative future, he could see Horus elevated to War Master, as originally intended, his pride and ambition carefully managed through the kind of paternal guidance that had shaped all the Primarchs during their formative years. The corruption might have been detected earlier, contained before it could spread through multiple legions, eliminated through measures that preserved rather than destroyed the bonds of brotherhood that had once seemed unbreakable. Yet that path would have required a different emperor, one willing to spend more time on personal relationships and less on the great projects that promised to secure humanity's long-term survival. The webway network might have remained a dream, deferred indefinitely, leaving human civilization vulnerable to the same warp dependence that had doomed so many species before them. Lionel Johnson emerged from the chamber's entrance, his stern features bearing news from the frontier regions where Imperial expansion continued under principles that balanced efficiency with compassion in ratios that would have seemed impossible during the Great Crusade's early years. The Ghoul Stars expedition reports first contact with human populations that have maintained civilization despite 10 millennia of isolation, the Dark Angel's Primarch announced, his voice carrying satisfaction that came not from conquest, but from reunion with long-lost cousins who had survived the darkness through their own courage and ingenuity. Their leaders request audience with Imperial representatives to discuss voluntary integration. They offer technological exchanges that could benefit both our civilizations. The expedition commander recommends proceeding with full diplomatic protocols rather than standard compliance procedures. The Emperor received this news with the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing principles validated through practical application. The patient approach that Sanguinius had advocated was bearing fruit throughout the galaxy, creating relationships based on mutual benefit rather than simple dominance and submission. Yet even as reports of success flowed through the Chamber's information networks, darker intelligence reminded all present that threats remained which could not be addressed through compassion alone. In the depths of space beyond the galactic rim, the scattered remnants of corruption nursed grudges that festered like infected wounds, planning their eventual return with patience that transcended mortal understanding. The astropathic choirs report increasing disturbances in the galactic east, Magnus observed, his psychic perception reaching out to touch upon currents of malevolence that stirred in dimensions adjacent to reality. Something stirs in the regions our star charts designate as the Eye of Terror. The exile has not eliminated the threat, merely delayed its manifestation. The weight of that intelligence settled over the assembled Primarchs like a shroud drawn across future hope. Yet it also served to validate the preparations that had consumed so much effort during the years of reconstruction. The Imperium that would face the next manifestation of chaos would be different from the one that had nearly been destroyed by civil war. More resilient, more vigilant, more unified in purpose, despite its organizational divisions. The Emperor rose from his throne with movements that sent subtle resonances through dimensions that existed beyond mortal perception, his perfect features reflecting depths of contemplation that encompassed the full scope of what had been achieved and what remained to be accomplished. "The question that haunts our deliberations," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber, despite its quiet tone, "is whether compassion or ruthlessness better serves the preservation of human civilization." Sanguinius believed that mercy was strength, that the preservation of what was worthy mattered more than the speed of conquest. Horus believed that only absolute victory could secure humanity's future. That sentiment was weakness that enemies would exploit. The philosophical chasm that had led to civil war remained unbridged despite the resolution that sacrifice had achieved. Around the throne chamber, the surviving Primarchs contemplated the implications of choices that continued to reverberate through every decision made in the aftermath of fraternal conflict. Both approaches carried wisdom, Guilliman observed, his analytical mind working to find synthesis within apparent contradiction. Rapid expansion secured the resources necessary for long-term survival, yet compassionate integration ensured that what was preserved remained worthy of preservation. The challenge lies in determining when each approach serves the greater good. The blood angels who maintained vigil before their father's memorial stirred slightly, their enhanced hearing detecting conversations that touched upon the principles their Primarch had died to defend. Brother Mephiston spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of genetic memory that preserved something essential about Sanguinius's perspective. "Our father understood that victory without honor was defeat wearing false colors," Mephiston declared, his words echoing through the chamber with the authority of absolute conviction. He chose to die rather than see humanity preserved through methods that would have destroyed everything worthy within it. That choice defines not merely his legacy, but the path we must follow if we are to remain human rather than becoming monsters wearing human faces. The Emperor contemplated this observation with the kind of attention he reserved for insights that cut through complexity to reveal essential truths. When he finally nodded, the gesture carried the weight of validation that transcended mere approval and approached the realm of divine sanction. The Angel of Death understood what I had forgotten in my focus upon long-term survival, he acknowledged, his words carrying depths of admission that few had ever heard from his lips. That some prices are too high to pay even for species preservation, that the methods we choose to achieve our goals become part of the legacy we leave for those who follow. The conversation continued with exchanges that would reshape imperial doctrine for centuries yet to come, each participant contributing insights drawn from perspectives that had been tested in the fires of conflict and tempered by the wisdom that comes only through bitter experience of loss. As the discussions wound toward their conclusion, the Emperor's gaze returned to the memorial that dominated the chamber's central space, his golden features reflecting depths of sorrow and pride in equal measure. The Angel of Death had spread his wings above a civilization threatened by corruption, and in his dying had ensured that the future would be illuminated by principles worthy of the sacrifices made to preserve them. The Great Crusade was ended, yet the dream it had sought to achieve endured in forms that its architects had never anticipated. Humanity would expand among the stars not through conquest alone, but through the kind of patient integration that preserved what was worthy while transforming what was flawed. The galaxy turned beneath constellations whose light carried the promise of futures yet unwritten, possibilities that stretched across cosmic timescales like branches of an infinite tree. The choices made in the aftermath of civil war would echo through those futures, determining whether the species that had dared to claim dominion over the stars would prove worthy of the trust that sacrifice had placed in their hands. In the silence that followed the last exchanges of the day's deliberations, the Emperor remained seated upon his throne, his enhanced perception reaching out across the vast reaches of space to touch upon worlds where human children played beneath alien suns, their laughter carrying across the void like music that made all the struggles and sacrifices worthwhile. The dream endured, tempered by wisdom, purchased with blood, strengthened by principles that had survived the test of ultimate challenge. And in that endurance lay the promise that whatever trials awaited among the stars, humanity would meet them not as conquerors drunk on their own power, but as guardians of something precious that was worth preserving across any span of time. The Angel of Death had given everything to ensure that such guardianship would be possible. Whether future generations would prove worthy of his sacrifice remained a question that only time and choice could answer. Yet in the golden light that bathed the throne chamber, hope itself seemed to take on substance, filling the vast spaces with promise that transcended the weight of accumulated sorrows and pointed toward possibilities that even prophetic visions could not fully encompass. The great work continued, and in its continuation lay the seed of everything yet to come.